Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another special episode of the Hugo's There podcast, video edition and audio only as well, covering some of the shorter fiction nominees for the Hugos this year. This time we're doing the novellas, and I've assembled another panel. By the way, my name is Seth Heasley. I'm the host of the Hugo's There podcast, and I have a bunch of returners and a few new faces, so I want to point them out first. So first, Kristen. Hi there, Kristen L.
Hi.
And Kristen L., you're a booktuber, right?
That's right. I focus mostly on science fiction and fantasy, and I like to talk a lot about the awards like the Hugo and the Nebulas and stuff.
Cool. It's great to have you. And then Gretchen. Hi there.
Hi, everybody.
Anything people need to know about you?
I am a writer and podcaster. I've been on hiatus for a couple of years, but I still currently edit for a website called The Fandomentals, where we do fandom and media analysis on books, music, games, television. I am the managing editor of Analysis. So I've got a lot of pieces up. It's been a while, but like I just recently did a book review in the last couple of months. So I still kind of, when I have the time and energy, I'm still working on things.
Cool. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So then the only other new face for the video anyway is Scott Ullery. Hey there.
Hey, Seth. Good to see you.
Yeah. Good to see you. Quick plug your podcast.
Oh, sure. Yeah. From Narrated Podcast. So we talk audiobooks, all genres, though heavy focused on science fiction and fantasy. And we do likewise talk some of the Hugo Awards. We've talked novellas and series and doing a Lodestar soon. So and also good for even if you don't listen to the audiobook versions, most of it is just discussion like this on books. So
yeah.
Whatever form.
Cool. Okay, and then a couple folks who haven't been on these this year anyway. We have Olav. Hey there.
Hello.
Hugo nominated Hugo
back.
Book Club. And we have Trish Madsen. Hey, Trish.
Hello.
Who is not Sarah. She's
That's
Sarah's
right.
sister.
As much as I sound like her, I am my own person.
Yes. And then we have some returners. We have Juan, Lori, Ivor, Cora, and Rob. Hey, everybody.
Howdy.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. And I think, Juan, you wanted to say something about the novellas kind of at the top.
The novellas have been experiencing a big renaissance, a resurgence. I mean, and thanks to Tor.com, which have completely, all of their novellas have dominated this category this year. And part of the reason is in 2018, when their first nomination, they decided to go really big and publish novellas as individual books. I mean, most of the novellas, not all, came out of the magazines, Asimov, Analog, Fantasy, and Science Fiction, and the like. And unfortunately, the online magazines, I think, many of them can only afford one novella a year. I think that's the stretch goal for the Uncanny magazine Kickstarter. If they can make all their stretch goals, they'll buy one novella for the whole year. So it's still a category. But as I said, they put a major marketing campaign and put people's attention and put eyeballs on the novella category. So we're in the golden age of novellas, and it seems to be going great.
Nice. Okay, and yeah, like you mentioned, we have a bunch of novellas from Tor.com, and we're going to get started with them. We're going to go through them in this order. We have Across the Green Grass Fields by Seanan McGuire, Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard, The Past is Red by Catherynne and Valente, A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and A Spindle Splintered. And I didn't write down the author. That's Alix E. Harrow, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And so to kick off the first discussion, we have Kristen L. for Across the Green Grass Fields.
Yeah, so this is another installment in the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. And this one, for those who are not all caught up in the series, that's okay. It does stand alone. It's not really related to any of the prior ones, but it does continue the theme of a child finding a portal to another world where they feel like they really belong more than they belong in this world. And so our main character in this book is Reagan, and she is a middle school student, and she discovers that she is intersex and has a lot of feelings about that and confides in a friend that she really should not have confided in. And because of that, ends up wandering into a portal that leads her to a world full of fantasy hoofed creatures. So we're talking kelpies, centaurs, unicorns. And it's a very fun, vivid, imaginative world. And she has her adventures and along the way learns a lot about belonging and destiny and friendship and family. And I think that's my wrap up.
It sounds good. And I didn't talk about spoiler policy for novellas. With the shorter fiction, short stories and novelettes, I feel like we just go spoilers right from the jump, and everybody can just read those in a single sitting and then be good about it. I do want to mention for the videos, I put chapters on for the individual stories. So if there's one that you're going to read and you don't want to get spoiled, you can jump right to that. We may try and stay spoiler light on some of them. But yeah, I'll put time codes in the audio version as well so that you can skip around if you need to. So, all right, with that, anybody else want to talk about Across the Green Grass Fields? I had teased Lori a little bit saying, hey, this is a horse book. You have to be on for this one. Although there's not all that many actual horses.
Yeah, a funny thing is that when Regan mentions horses when she's in the Hooflands, I think it's one of the centaurs who says, "What's a horse?" And
Right.
she's just kind of like, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this one. I've not read any of the Wayward Children series. I own a couple of them, but I haven't actually read them. I've enjoyed Seanan McGuire's work in other places. She had a great short story in the John Joseph Adams and Daniel H. Wilson edited anthology Robot Uprisings called, with this amazing title, We're All Misfit Toys in the Aftermath of the Velveteen War. It's a fantastic story, so I highly recommend it. Okay, go ahead, Juan.
Well, I really like the story. I mean, and it's very different from the previous Wayward Children stories because we don't usually the stories take place, I think, after the kids have come to the place where to the school or the halfway house of people who are recovering from portal fantasies are. We're seeing it before then.
Mhm.
And it's a good adventure. It's a little bit different. I mean, we see the whole adventure, and I actually did a check to make sure that this is a prequel because I did a search on, and I thought it was pronounced Regan, but I could be wrong about that. But I did a search on Regan's name and all the other books to say that she wasn't in them, so it's a future book. And I just thought it was interesting that she decided to focus on the before part because usually we see it's recovering older children or young adults trying to recover from their portal fantasy experience. So it's interesting we see what's going on, and I was engaged with it. I really liked it. It was, okay, she's doing something new. Good for her.
Nice. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I enjoyed this one. I agree that it is probably the most standalone of the entire series. I mean, if you're starting the series, because it is on that ballot as well, but this is probably not where I would encourage somebody to start for the series as a whole. But it is definitely the most standalone in that sense. Yeah.
Cool. Go ahead, Cora.
Well, I'm not the biggest fan of the Wayward Children series. I did like the original, the first novella, which actually did win the Hugo in Helsinki. But afterwards, I felt that the whole idea was of those kids falling through a portal was wearing a little thin. However, I liked this one quite a bit. First of all, because it's a lot more disconnected from the wider Wayward Children world than some of the other ones. And though I'm not really a horse person, I think Seanan's love for horses and for My Little Pony, if you don't know, Seanan is a huge collector of My Little Pony toys. And I think her love for those things really comes through which makes it interesting. Also, about this Regan, that she's intersex. A lot of people who are intersex, a lot of time realize it during early puberty, largely because the puberty doesn't happen. It's like it's supposed to happen, or expected to happen. Some people also have it found out earlier, and let's say it's not. I went to university with a she was basically turned into a woman, so she was intersex and had the misfortune of it having been found out while she was a baby, and And well, she's the person who convinced me that we need accommodations for intersex people. We can't force people into two genders. So yes, I like the existence of an intersex character, and also well, she finds out at the time when a lot of intersex people find out they're intersex, and also yes, she gets bullied for basically not conforming to what is believed to be feminine.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olaf.
I think it's worth noting that easy to dive into prose is more difficult than it looks. This isn't a book with huge rhetorical flourishes. And I find that actually kind of refreshing. This is a book that is written to be to draw you into the narrative. It's very immersive writing, and I think I'm on record as not being a fan of series going on too long, but it's good to have a jumping off point like this. And I thought as Cora brought up, the representation of intersex people, as well as the intersex phobia out there and the malaise of that. I thought that was very. I thought that really added a lot to the book.
Yeah. Trish, go ahead.
This one was not high on my list. I loved the beginning book, Every Heart a Doorway. There are now 8 books in the series, and to me, some of them are a bit hit or miss. It is good. She's taking different types of people going into the portals and having very different experiences. So you definitely can't really judge one book in the series by another one. This one, to me, went on quite a long time with the community building and took a long time to reach a crisis point at the end. And so for me, it was not my favorite in this series, but tastes differ.
Sure, true. Gretchen, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to, excuse me, talk about a little bit more about the intersex representation, which I will go on record as saying I am not intersex. So I can only speak from my very limited perspective. It would be really nice if we had a person from that community who is on right now to speak to their community. But one thing I did want to say that I thought was really interesting about the way that Seanan McGuire told the story was about how the character who is intersex goes into an environment in which is confronted by a fantasy creature that, while not the same, is a creature that is more than one thing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the community is a community of centaurs, so they are, half human, half horse. And while, that's clearly not the same thing as being intersex, and, intersex folks are not half one thing, half of another.
Right.
And the spectrum of being intersex is broad and includes a lot of different things. It felt like what Seanan McGuire was doing was creating a community in which Regan could at least, kind of symbolically start to come to accept herself, going into a community of people that are very comfortable being more than one thing, presenting as more than one thing, in a way that, like, the human world that she's coming from is unwilling to accept, entities or beings that present in a non, specific, not like an encapsulated way of, like, you are a horse or you are a person. You can't be both. You can't be in between. You can't be something more complicated than just a single entity that we see you as. She's going into an environment in which beings are many things at the same time. And they look a little bit different and they present a little bit different, and it's a very comfortable space. And while, like other people are saying, this was not super high on my list in terms of like voting for it. Like, I did appreciate what she was trying to do in creating a fantasy space that specifically spoke to a place where someone who is intersex might feel safe, might start to feel comfortable loving themselves, getting to know themselves, being willing to embrace themselves for who they are. And it's interesting as I can't remember who was saying that, like, I think it was Juan, that most of the other Portal worlds, we see the characters after they come back. And in this one, we see, the character is going into and being there. And that, again, feels like a part of this story about someone who doesn't fit in a community going in and finding a safe space where they can love themselves. And that's the story. The story is going into like a pocket space that is separate from our society, learning how to love and embrace yourself before going back into broader society and the world and having to face whatever that world feels about you. That like Regan was in a sense given a space where she could grow into herself, understand herself, feel comfortable with herself, and then go back out into the world that is still intersex phobic, that still is going to have judgment, but she's been given a chance to celebrate herself and be comfortable with herself so that she's more likely to be resilient in the face of what's going on in her community. And that feels very like relevant to, probably intersex experience. And I'm sure any other kind of queer or non-traditional gender, presentation experience. And I just really like that Seanan is doing that and is doing that for a community that doesn't likely get a lot of representation. I can't speak to how good the representation is, how accurate it is to the intersex experience, because like I said, I'm not, but I still deeply appreciate that it's even being addressed in speculative fiction at all, because they're a community that is very often ignored.
Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, so I thought that this was a really strong book. The imagery was just fantastic. Like, I especially loved the description of the unicorns. I thought it was really well done. The world building was great, but I think like I'm gonna probably rank this lowest on my ballot just because I don't tend to vibe a lot with YA, and this feels very young, especially compared to the whole rest of the category. So I'm actually really curious to hear maybe what some other people have to say about that too. Like, how do you compare a YA novella against a whole bunch of other like very much adult novellas? Like, it feels like apples and oranges. So I, as a voter, feel a little bit like this is not a bad book, but I just didn't enjoy it as much. So I'm not sure how to think about that. I almost wish there was a YA category and an adult category for novellas specifically.
Yeah. I wanted to know from anybody who's read any of the other books, do unicorns occur in any of the others, and are they as dumb as they are in this book? Because I found that delightful.
I don't think so, but it reminded me of that Pixar movie that, what was it called? Beyond.
Onward.
Onward.
Yeah.
The unicorns are portrayed as vermin in that world.
Right. Go ahead, Laurie.
So I agree, Kristen, with what you were saying about it feeling more like a YA novel. When I was reading it, I thought, this is a nice story. I like the story. I think it's well executed, but for me, it feels very much like a middle grade book, which is absolutely fine, but it does feel strange reading it alongside the other nominees. And I think it's important to say that just because a book is about a child doesn't necessarily make it a child's book. I would contrast it with the Binti trilogy, which Nnedi Okorafor has frequently said, this is not YA, stop calling it YA. That's a book about a teen, but it also has genocide in it, it has war in it, it has very adult themes, but it's about a young person, whereas this book I felt like is a book about a young person that is for young people, which is absolutely fine, but it is difficult to compare it with other books that obviously as an adult I can connect with better. That being said, I really like a few things about this, and in particular, we've talked a lot about the intersex representation, and Kristen, I think this sort of spins a little bit off of what you were talking about, or I'm sorry, Gretchen, some of the things that you brought up about the representation. I like that in this book, we get to see her have a positive childhood experience, because I think a lot of times when we see characters who are trans or intersex or gender nonconforming, we see them as adults recovering from the trauma that they experienced because of discrimination or abuse during childhood. And I was really happy that that doesn't happen to her. She gets to have a loving family. She gets to, although it's, absolutely traumatic to be dropped into the hooflands and, not live with humans anymore, she gets to grow up with this community that supports her. And she certainly has a bad experience when she confides in her friend, who is sort of a Regina George Mean Girls character. So I think we all saw that coming. And I was a little puzzled that Reagan herself didn't see it coming, because Reagan had participated in some bullying with this girl before. So she has that really bad experience. But I also think that that experience is universal. I think all of us have confided in a friend, particularly as children or as tweens, and had that friend violate our trust. So it's a fairly universal experience that I think most readers could probably connect with. And then she gets to go on and reach early adulthood, because she's an older teen toward the end of the book, without having, years and years of being mistreated or being marginalized because of her intersex identity. And so I really like that we get to see a story where she's not recovering from a trauma. She actually managed to reach early adulthood without experiencing a lot of that. And so I hope that the series comes back to her. This is the only Wayward Children book that I've read, so I don't know if we see the same characters over again or if we end up seeing them as adults, but I'm hearing a lot of reference to stories where people are dealing with having left the world that they were dropped into. Okay, so Scott says in the chat that it does come back to her in the next novella. So I'm glad to hear that, because I am interested to see how she functions after this experience, because I like that she got to have a happy, albeit very unusual childhood. So I think that that's something that this book did really well.
I do have to say, I feel a little bad for her parents, because she's gone for like 6 years, right?
Oh, totally. And that they were like nice, loving parents. I think a lot of times we see the child escape parents that aren't so good. And in this instance, it's so sad. So I would like to see how the parents react when she turns back up. But I guess she didn't necessarily have the choice to turn right back around and march back through the tree and go home. But yeah, I was thinking about the parents a lot and wondering, I mean, I think we know what that experience looks like on this side of the portal. But I do think that the book did that well. And I liked, without getting into too much spoiler territory, there is sort of a premise that monarchy is a bit of a hoax, and I enjoyed that theme.
Yes. Go ahead, Rob.
Okay. Wow. There's a lot that's been said here so far. I wanted to address one point about lack of stylistic flourishes. I don't think they're obvious, but I was going to address it, and then we got into the whole YA thing. Is it or isn't it? And what I was going to cite, maybe the most YA thing about this book and the Wayward Children's books generally, the way that Seanan McGuire as narrator will sometimes depart from the actual storytelling to address the reader about some facet or another about the way the world works. I wish I had an example there, but yeah. It's, you see that in YA somewhat, and it's, and the way McGuire does it, it's not so much like beating someone over the head with, your story's theme, as just taking the reader into confidence. And that I don't think you see it as much in some of the more plot-driven Wayward Children books, the ones with lots of characters doing lots of things, she's concentrating on keeping the story moving with those. But I think you saw it a little more in this one, which focused so intensely on one character. And so the plot gave you some room to breathe. There was more room for description, world building, and so on like that. It occurs to me this kind of thing is maybe related. You could draw comparisons to her Small Gods series with Lee Moyer that's up for the fanzine Hugo this year, I believe. It's all online, but these little parables about the way the world works as revealed through how these individual deities, the god of kitchenettes or whatever, things like that, how they function. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Nice. Go ahead, Cora.
Well, about seeing that it feels a bit YA, it does feel younger. Also, it does feel, in general, the Wayward Children series feels a bit younger than, for example, the October Day series. And this one feels younger simply because the protagonist is in is it what's it called, a tween at the on early, a young teenager at the beginning, and also because of the horsey theme, it does feel a bit younger. However, first of all, the Lodestar is a fairly new development. It's only been around, I think, for 5 or 6 years now. And the Lodestar is explicitly for novel. I don't know what the cutoff now. I would have to look it up what the word count cutoff is, but it is explicitly for novels. And I think largely also I think because a lot of Wayward Children novels, I think 6 of 8 so far have been nominated for Hugo Awards, and always in the novella category. So that's probably where nominators put it by default. Also, we have had explicit YA or even middle grade books winning in novella. I mean, Coraline by Neil Gaiman, which is, it's not even YA, it's middle grade. And it won in novella several years ago. I forgot how many, whenever it came out. And the Graveyard book, also by Gaiman, which is also more YA and or middle grade leaning, also won a Hugo several years ago. I think it was in best novel. I think it's not now.
Yeah, it
was
was
novella.
No,
Was
it was
best
novel.
novel.
Yep.
But that was before we had the Lodestar. So, and of course with the Lodestar, we also have the issue that, for example, the Naomi Novik books, Deadly Education and whatever this year's, I've forgotten the name, the title. Sorry. It's called. They are marketed as. They're marketed as adult fiction, but people keep nominating them for the Lodestar because they feel very YA, even though they are marketed as adult books. So it's a slippery slope anyway.
Go ahead, Olaf.
Just feel like the term, I don't like the term YA. It is just a marketing thing. There's no hard line test. There's no bright line test to figure out what falls into YA and what does not. So I don't mind ranking this against other books that might fall, that might be aimed at an older audience. I don't see that it needs to be in a different category.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay. I just wanted to pop in briefly to the effect. I tend to agree with the perspective that the Wayward Children books are not necessarily YA works as such, but works for adults that happen to have adolescents, teenagers as their protagonists. They do seem they're not as obviously, they don't go into as dark spaces as the Binti books do, but they do seem more addressed to people who have college age or later, who've knocked around a bit and who maybe had some of their childhood illusions knocked out of them by that point. But having said that, I would have loved these books if I'd encountered them as a teenager myself. So there is that paradox there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gretchen.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Olaf was saying about YA as a marketing term. And what sometimes happens, or at least that I have seen very frequently recently, where especially women and especially women of color get labeled as YA purely for no other reason than that they are women or women of color. The assumption being that they are writing for a less sophisticated audience. If you can't see me, if you're listening to this on audio, I'm using a lot of air quotes because so much of YA is typically used as in a pejorative way that I feel like there are two things that happen. YA as a marketing term in book world, which is like, we are specifically choosing these books to market directly to teenagers because we believe that they are appealing to them and they are a market that is consuming books that have a specific vibe to them. or specific themes. And then there is what happens where people from the outside looking at that and going like, oh, that's just for kids, that's YA. And it's treated as if teenagers are interested in like less sophisticated things or less sophisticated topics or like quote unquote less sophisticated prose, that like you need to have like high level prose. If you have lower level prose, then you must be YA. If you're talking about teenage characters, you must be YA. If you are talking about diversity or inclusivity or have, you know, characters who are queer, then like you must be quote unquote YA, because the assumption being that like, you know, high level science fiction and fantasy is only about, you know, what golden age, you know, what, you know, classic science fiction or fantasy about. And anytime you deviate from that, it's YA, because it's a way of diminishing and devaluing these works and saying, well, they're not for sophisticated audiences. They're not for grownups. They're for people who want, you know, to read less, you know, sophisticated things. And it bothers me a lot because so often it's used to be dismissive. Because like Nnedi Okorafor, for example, is a really great author who gets labeled YA all the time. And like, I have read pretty much everything that Nnedi Okorafor has written because I love her. And no, she like, it's not, yeah, like, and even if it were YA, there's nothing wrong with YA. There's nothing like people who love to read YA, great, love it, consume it. Like there's nothing wrong about YA. There's nothing less valuable or less interesting or less sophisticated. I've read some really amazing YA books. I mean, Iron Widow this year. Holy, I mean, like, good Lord, holy cow. What a, like an angry, fierce, aggressive book that like, I wish we saw that level of anger sometimes in like, you know, fiction marketed to adults. But anyway, I just wanted to speak on that idea that like YA is treated as a pejorative. And so it's used to devalue, especially the works of women and women of color.
I'd just like to bring up a case example. So Naomi Kritzer, the Catnet stories, you know, her work wasn't being labeled as YA, and she won a Hugo. And the moment it becomes a novel, they start talking about it as YA, and it gets relegated to the YA ghetto, and it absolutely deserved to be in Chaos on Catnet, the most recent one, absolutely deserved to be in the conversation for the novel Hugo, but people kept calling it YA and it didn't get considered.
Mm-hmm.
Trish, go ahead.
I definitely agree with Gretchen on what she said about the YA categorization and how it is used to sneer at some books. But looking at the first book in the series, Every Hearted Doorway, that was a very complex book with a lot going on. This is not. Regan is dealing with a single issue most of the time, being intersex or bullying, or fitting in with the new centaur family, who it happens that everybody in the society is nice, and it's only when she goes to the fair and the bad fawn and other people kidnap her that things get more difficult. So I absolutely think this is a YA book compared to the first book in the series, which arguably, you know, anybody can read and get some interesting ideas and thoughts out of. Not that some people can't get interesting ideas and thoughts about this, like as mentioned earlier, the falseness of monarchy and stuff, but it is far less complex than the first book in the series. So I would put it firmly in YA.
Go ahead, Cora.
Well, again, about the YA as a marketing term and category is a fairly new thing. It's 2025. I think it started up by the Harry Potter. When I was at the YA age, there was no such thing as YA books. There were children's books. Then there were books for teens. We called them, I'm not American, so we called them Jugendbuch, youth books. And those books for teens were mostly, they were problem novels, and occasionally, if you got lucky, you got something like translated Sweet Valley High books. And at the time, a lot of most people graduated to adult fiction sometime around the time they grew out of the children's books. So 12, 13, 14. I remember that I searched around for a while, like, okay, those books I used to read no longer do it for me. What can I read now? Then I started reading the books that were in the house like weird romances and stuff about 40-year-old women getting divorces, which was absolutely boring, and some historical novels which should have been interesting but were boring too because of an endless family saga. Then I found science fiction, and that was great. But we didn't, and we had a lot of Hugo finalists and even winners, which would have been YA and would have been basically shoveled off to the lodestar today. I mean, a Harry Potter book. Harry Potter, I think, and the Order of the Phoenix, it won the Hugo in 2000. Goblet of Fire, okay. Yeah. I keep forgetting which one it is. But a Harry Potter book, okay, J.K. Rowling is a turf and she's terrible, but we didn't know that back in 2000. And it won the Hugo. Still, I think the best-selling novel ever to win a Hugo. Ender's Game. Ender's Game is, I think it's even middle school. It's a school literature in the US. And again, he's a terrible person. But again, we didn't know this in 1986 or whenever it won. And Ender's Game is, I think, also classified as YA today. Of course, we have all the Heinlein juveniles. I'm not sure if any of them ever won, but they were definitely nominated. And they were also, so they were called juveniles at the time. And Andre Norton, of course, had Hugo nominations, definitely for Witchworld. Andre Norton's books were also considered juveniles, so for younger readers. So they were part, what we call YA now was part of the general science fiction genre and read by adults, and absolutely no one minded. I mean, the Hugo voters back in 1986 who voted for Ender's Game to win, those were not 15 or 16-year-olds. Those were adult voters, because it was a book that spoke to a lot of people. I'm also a bit skeptical about putting YA has become something of a ghetto. Because it's a good thing that teenagers have a lot of great books to read, because nowadays there are a lot of great YA fantasy and horror and science fiction books which did not exist when I was at the age. However, it's also something of a ghetto, because sometimes you read one of those books and say, okay, why exactly is this YA? YA, just because the protagonist is young, because there's lots of violence here. I mean, the Sarah J. Maas books are a perfect example. Her latest ones have been marketed as adult books. And she's, of course, one of those people who constantly get banned from school libraries in the US because apparently there was a sex scene or bad word or something in there. So yeah, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm really, really happy for young people today that they have a lot of great books to read, which also cater to them, but that they don't have to sift through whatever's in the home and decide that Marie-Louise Fischer definitely is not for them. But on the other hand, a lot of good authors and good books are getting ghettoized, and I'm not happy. Like, for example, the Naomi Kritzer, Chaos on Catnet, and Catfishing on Catnet books.
All right, anything else on this book, or should we move on? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Elder Race, and Olav, you're going to kick off that discussion. And by the way, I did want to say, I don't think I ever said hello to Ivor. So, hey there.
So
I'm used to it, don't worry.
How does a sullen, stranded, last of a crew and an earther dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the galaxy by Providence, admonished to be a watcher, become a wizard in place of scholar? Adrian Tchaikovsky really plays with two perspectives in this story to show Clarke's law in practice, that being any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. On one hand, it's a fantasy story told from the perspective of Linnes, who's a minor princess in a medieval fantasy kingdom. And on the other hand, it's a science fiction story told from the perspective of Nier, an anthropologist stranded on a fallen world. Linnes is traveling to a wizard's tower to seek his aid in defeating a demon that threatens her realms, while Nier, who is that wizard, is depressed and living out his extended lifespan cut off from the civilization from which he came. The strength of the novel comes from the interesting world building as well as these twin perspectives and how they conflict.
Nice. All right, let's open it up for discussion on this one. Anybody have anything to say about Elder Race? I'll say this was my favorite, far and away my favorite. I don't know if it was because I read it in print and it was the last one that I read, but I just finished this one last night and just adored it. My favorite was the chapter that had the twin tales where Nier is trying to explain as best he can kind of the history, and it shows how I'm sorry, what is the name? Lynn? I can't remember.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Linus.
Yeah, and how it's being heard by the folks on the planet. So, okay, a bunch of hands went up. So I probably stole everybody's thunder there. Ivor, when we haven't heard from you, when you go ahead.
Okay, really just two things to say about this. First of all, I think it was a really good novella that described clinical depression so well that I spotted it within the first 2 pages of saying this guy is clinically depressed. And I could, I thought that's very relatable, because it's one of the things in science fiction that I find is something we don't explore very, very well, because mental health will be a massive issue if we ever do get off world. Massive issue being on world. But I did totally understand and relate to the character, because it's loneliness and loss were the 2 things I think he was really suffering from, and also a form of maybe a misidentity as well. What was his role? The other second thing to it that kind of stood out to me, without giving too many spoilers, but as the tale progressed with the fantasy and the science fiction kind of DNA through it, the last third seemed to kind of say it wasn't inspired, I'd say, but I would say had a lot in common perhaps with the Southern Reach trilogy. Jeff Vandermeer kind of rang in my ears thinking, it's a great idea, because there is so much it's unknown, and it leaves a lot of guesswork to the reader. So that's my point. It was really good. I really enjoyed it.
Go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say this, the mix of the I'll say the science fictional view and the fantasy view is just a great personification, I think, of the, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I mean, this is probably one of the best kind of demonstrations of that, including just that side by side kind of look, as well as just the alternating chapters. You see it there as well. And I agree with the points in terms of the representation of the depression and the mental health issues, and the way that that's attempted to solve through technology, not particularly successfully, is an interesting kind of exploration there as well. So this was definitely one of my favorites, even though it doesn't have an audiobook version, but I didn't count it against it.
I'm kind of thinking that because of that, I don't know how you would produce that chapter.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit. I think it could be done. My own headcanon, I'd love to see a Matt Kramer and Kate Redding pairing on that. They do a lot together, and I could see them kind of alternating back and forth. You'd probably have to play around with where do you do the breaking point, because you'd have to do, because there were some breakups in that narrative. Do you do it, alternating paragraphs, or but I'm sure that's why they didn't do one at the time, but I'd still love to see one on it. But it's also great in print as well.
Trish, go ahead.
I'm interested in books that deal with translation issues and stories, and this of course had a lot of it, because they're coming, not only are they coming from 2 totally different mindsets, but the language has drifted apart so far that he does have to use a translation interface, and things just get shunted into terms that the woman will understand. And so he's trying to explain, no, I'm not a magician. I do science. And the translation is essentially, no, I'm not a magician. I do magic.
Right. I'm a wizard.
Right. And I just, I thought that was so well executed, showing the frustration of trying to explain, and people putting things into terms that they understand. So I loved that bit. The story itself, a lot of it did not surprise me. In the general arc of the story, I was very surprised when we turned out when we find out the nature of the enemy that is putting the curse on the land. And I won't spoil it for anyone, but I definitely was not expecting the thing that it turned out to be, because this was outside of context and experience that I was expecting from prior clues in the story. So I thought that was very well done. This is the beginning of it feels so old-fashioned because it's kind of in an old-fashioned context, almost fairy tale-ish world. So that kind of prose style can be very soothing for me, but in terms of execution, Adrian Tchaikovsky can write so many different kinds of books and does so well at all of them. This one is super high on my list.
Nice. My only beef with it is the title just makes it sound like a fantasy video game that I wouldn't be interested in. Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought this had so many super cool ideas. I mean, I love the juxtaposition of fantasy and sci-fi. It just feels like it's equal parts both, and that was super fun. I love the discussion of depression and like this idea of like futuristic technology as a way to deal with it. It just seemed really cool, like just put everything on pause and then deal with it when you're in a better space to do that. That's super cool. But I've realized I've read a few Adrian Tchaikovsky things at this point, and I think for me personally, his writing doesn't always flow really good for me. Like, I feel like a lot of the times for me personally, he'll spend a lot of time on the parts that are not very interesting to me. And I'd be like, you have this super cool idea and I want to explore that, but we're taking our sweet time over here in this part that's not interesting to me. So I know a lot of people that like adore Adrian Tchaikovsky and are super excited that he finally got a nomination. And so yeah, I think it's really good, but also not one of my favorites in this category, just because I don't super vibe with his writing style.
Lori, go ahead.
I really liked the theme of you have to feel your feelings. So Kristen, you mentioned how he has the technology where he can put things on pause and deal with it when he has the time and the space to deal with it. But I think what's interesting about it is that he will deal with all of it. And it's also all gotten sort of jumbled up into this soup of reactions. So at one point he knows that he would be experiencing joy if he didn't have his restraining technology engaged. And he's like, I wonder how that's going to come out later when I finally, switch off my, I think it's the DCS. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But that restrains his emotional reactions. So I liked the idea that he can switch them off, but it's not tamped down at all. And it also may come out kind of weird, which is, what happens when we don't cope with things. We can't predict how they're going to come out. So I appreciated that. And then I like how, even though this is overall, it's a, kind of an adventure story and there are very serious things happening, the juxtaposition with the fantasy and the science fiction is an opportunity to inject humor. Touching back on what Trish said with the linguistic things, my favorite line is when he says, I think Trish, you may have said this, where he's trying to think, how do I explain this? How do I explain that I'm not a wizard? I'm actually a wizard, or maybe more of a wizard. And it was just so funny. So I enjoyed having a couple of opportunities to just chuckle out loud while I was reading what, it was kind of a monster story. And I absolutely also thought of the Southern Reach trilogy. And the other thing that I thought about was Stranger Things, when they're in the Upside Down and there's the big, huge mind flayer, and it's like viney and sort of scruffy looking and mossy looking. And then there are like the patches other places in the Upside Down, and they're all clearly psychically connected. And so that really helped me imagine it, having seen that and also having read Southern Reach. So some of that felt a little bit familiar, but I still really enjoyed it.
Some of the kind of structures that were created out of formerly living things reminded me of The Girl with All the Gifts, where all the people who have been affected kind of group together and go to seed. Sorry, spoilers for that one. That's another one that sounds like a young adult book, but is definitely not a young adult book. Gretchen, go ahead.
Yeah, so I loved this story. This was my favorite. I've had a lot of thoughts about it. My girlfriend has also been reading through the Hugo nominations, and she and I spent the most amount of time talking about this. I think we were somewhere in the level of like 3 hours talking about this novella. Couple of things that really stood out to me the most. I love the linguistic stuff. My background is in ancient languages. I have a master's degree in Hebrew. So anytime that I read a science fiction story that actually cares about trying to do language things, and especially with cross-cultural linguistic barriers, trying to communicate, I will love it. I think that this story did a really, really interesting job about the ways in which what is possible with communication. I think that ultimately Adrian Tchaikovsky, at least in this story, is fairly pessimistic about the possibility for ultimately fully being able to understand across linguistic barriers, or at least the narrator is, at least Nir is, because even by the end of the story, Nir is basically like, I don't know if I'm ever going to understand this language. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to fully communicate with these people, but I'm going to try anyway. But it felt like that at least Nir is not entirely hopeful that he's ever going to be able to fully be able to cross that barrier, no matter, even if he has, all of the technology in his brain to do so, which is interesting. Again, I don't know how much that reflects Adrian Tchaikovsky's own perspective as an author. But it was a unique perspective to me to have someone, in this kind of a setting, have a much more pessimistic view of communication. I'm so used to watching Star Trek, where they have universal communicators that just perfectly translate across any linguistic barriers. And the assumption being that well, of course, someday we will have the technology that makes it possible for us to perfectly communicate ourselves with an alien species. No questions, no lag. So as someone who studied linguistics, it was interesting to me to have a writer be much more, not quite as hopeful about whether or not we'll be able to fully communicate across those barriers. I really liked the academic perspective that Nir is an academic. He's an anthropologist. And this is a story about, to me, this felt like a story about an academic questioning whether the framework of academia actually allows him to live a fully human life. Because he's so cut off from emotions, from connection. And in the system he comes from, that's a value, that's a virtue. It's perceived that as a scientist, he should not be able to connect with people. He's supposed to shut off his emotions. He's supposed to look, quote unquote, objectively at these people, to be able to, quote unquote, objectively record their life. But what we get from the story is that the reality that objectivity isn't possible, that Nir, because he's trying to cut off his emotional connection with these people, isn't actually understanding them in the way that he's unable to fully communicate himself. He can't fully understand the culture that he's supposed to be observing because it requires subjectivity, it requires participation, it requires connection. And I really appreciate that. And it was an interesting, because I was looking at it more of this is, an academic character and an academic perspective, I immediately thought of Arcady Martin and A Memory Called Empire, which Arcady Martin is an academic herself. And that book, that duology has a perspective of a similar kind of, how do academics think about their subject? How do they relate to the thing that they study? You can I feel like you can tell reading those books that she studied ancient history and has this kind of ambivalent, I both love ancient empire and feel uncomfortable with it, but there's some beautiful things about it. It makes beautiful art and poetry, but it's still bad. And this felt like a book that has a similar ambivalence about academia, that it recognizes that there are some things that we can benefit from an academic perspective, but also it limits us. Nir is limited in his ability to communicate and connect with the characters around him because of his academic, perspective as an anthropologist. And the only other thing I wanted to say about that was that connects with this kind of, his human upgrades. I'm always really interested in stories that are willing to look at sci-fi and say, what are the ways that humans can upgrade themselves? Or how would we technologically modify ourselves in the future? And the idea that someone would come up with a computer system that allows you to limit your experience of emotions feels totally feasible to me. That this would be a thing that some point someone would decide, hey, maybe we should limit our emotions. That will allow us to experience the world, quote unquote, more objectively. And I really like that he was willing, that like, this is a book that felt like it was grappling with what do quote unquote, upgraded humans look like? How would their experience of the world be different? And how would it maybe be problematic? Because as people are saying, he's clinically depressed. And some of that is related to his technology and what the technology enables him to do, but also limits him. So
yeah,
those are my thoughts for now.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, wow. I really love this story too, and read it last night also. So, and maybe some of that intensity transferred to my appreciation of the story, but yeah. For a lot of the reasons people are mentioning, the linguistics, the blending of fantasy and science fiction elements, the originality of the antagonist or phenomenon or whatever it is they're dealing with, and the portrayal of depression. I wanted to mention briefly in connection with the alternating perspectives between the princess and the anthropologist. It reminded me a little, and it's interesting, Tchaikovsky dedicated the book to Gene Wolfe and cited Wolfe's story Trip Trap, which it's been a long time since I've read it. I barely remember it. But the story I found myself thinking of with this was, of all things, a young person's novel from the 70s called Enchantress from the Stars, which has a similar multiple viewpoint narration with three different representatives of three different civilizations that works. There's one medieval tech, one which you get the idea is a new starfaring race, but they're colonialist exploiters who are going to ravage the planet if they're not checked. And then you have one somewhat more advanced race that's studying but trying not to interfere with things, and they're confronted with a dilemma when this other starfaring race, which doesn't know about them, is about to encroach on this the medieval tech planet. And it's by a woman named Sylvia Louise Engdahl. And I read this as a teenager in the late 70s myself. And I don't think I realized till just now how challenging that kind of thing is and how tricky it is to pull off even today. And I don't know, is anybody else familiar with this book at all? Wow. Okay. Again, speaks to the issue of how young people's books can get marginalized and women authors. But Sylvia Louise Engdahl, Enchantress from the Stars, highly recommended if you get to it. But this is definitely not in any way, shape, or form a young person's book. I was very impressed by the part that starts at about page 83 in the book version, where he turns off his DCS, and then his first person narration immediately changes character, although it's like you don't notice it too much at first, but it's like is less reserved, and then his paragraphs get longer and more intense, and as his emotions just sort of overcome him through this. I was very much impressed by that passage, as well as the split chapter between Nior, is that right? Nior?
Near, I think.
Yeah, Near and Linus.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're two different perspectives, how he was saying it and how she was hearing it. So anyway, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cora.
Well, this one's also, it was on my ballot, my nomination ballot, and it is my hands down favorite of the actual Hugo finalists in this category. In a lot of categories, it's like, okay, I know which ones will go near the bottom, but there's like 3 or 4 vying for the top. This one is also opposite. It's pretty much clear this one will go in my number 1 spot. And yes, for the reasons I liked it, first of all, I'm a professional translator and occasional linguist. So of course I love the translation and language difficulties and communication difficulties issues because, okay, not quite as extreme as some of the ones we have here, but you do run into such issues all the time. So I loved this. Another thing I really loved is also this is something we used to see a lot, but no longer see as much, that we basically have what looks like a fantasy world and a fantasy novel, and also not like the epic fantasy that is fashionable now. It looks like more like a traditional sword and sorcery novel, which was always personally the secondary world fantasy genre I preferred. So yeah, I loved that, and then it gradually turns out to be a science fiction world. And basically what we're seeing here is Clarke's law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Mhm.
And it literally is indistinguishable from magic here, because Neil can't even make Linnes understand that no, he's not a wizard, he's just a scientist. And
Yeah.
he doesn't even have the word for it. And this was a thing in the 1960s and 70s. That we had fantasy worlds which turned out to be science fiction. A lot of Andre Norton's books are like that, Witch World and Odile and lots of them. Rokannon's World by Ursula K. Le Guin, her debut novel from the mid-60s, is one that a lot of people quote in relation to this book, probably because it's still quite well known in the print. The Pern novels by Anne McCaffrey from roughly the same area, another example. Pern is a fantasy world which has dragons, a science fiction world which has dragons. The Enchantress from the Stars, which Rob mentioned, which I have to admit I'd never heard of, seems to be another one of the same line. And then there's one which I'm sure none of you has ever heard of, called Sword of Lancor by one Howard L. Corey, which was a husband and wife writing team who wrote a few science fiction novels in the 1960s, and a lot of erotica novels, which also has this. So I think someone at Nerds of the Feather said, I think it was Joe Cherry, then they discussed the finals, like, oh, this feels so old-fashioned. And yes, it does feel a bit old, but I like the fact that it takes an older mode of mixing science fiction or fantasy world, which turns out to be a science fiction world, because we don't see that a lot anymore. And I liked it a lot. And also I think Adrian Tchaikovsky, he's hit and miss for me. I don't love every single one of his books, but when he's good, he's very good. And he has been criminally overlooked by the Hugos. I mean, he's won the Clarke Award, but and a lot of other British awards, but for some reason, I don't know if he's not that popular in the US, but the Hugos and also the Nebulas keep overlooking him. So I'm really glad he finally at least got a nomination.
Nice. Ivor, go ahead.
Just to take this on a different tact, I trying to see where Adrian Tchaikovsky what he was thinking of and referring to, where his inspiration was coming from. And one of the themes I kind of picked up on was kind of regression of society. And given one would hope that he's written it in the past couple of years, I don't think it would be too much to say that he's maybe taken the population's reaction to COVID as signs that we are probably regressing slightly, and how that might happen when we are lost contact with the scientific base or an intelligentsia base. Because I got that impression, I have something I don't understand, it's a demon. And I don't think we're far off that with some of the things that have arisen in the 21st century, whereby probably the next playground will probably be cast up as being demons. So I think he was actually being a wee bit of a kind of a commentary on society as much as present day society as much as it was on science fiction and fantasy societies.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olav.
Sorry. It seems to me that the Rokannon's World comparison is particularly apt, because the sorcerer in this is the scientist who is perceived as a sorcerer, I should say, is actually an anthropologist. And of course, Ursula Le Guin's parents were anthropologists. There's a thread of anthropology throughout a lot of her work. And it feels to me like this book is trying to be Lord of the Rings as reinterpreted by Ursula Le Guin. That seems to be the aim. So it's a deconstruction of that Gandalf trope, that unknowable wizard secrets that the little folk were not meant to know, kind of trope, reimagined. And my final point, I did love this novel. I was enthusiastic to talk about it here today. But the final point I'd like to make is that I think it's really interesting that this particular shortlist for novella contains 3 different works that grapple with well-established fairy tale frameworks. It's interesting to parallel this one to the Seanan McGuire work, to the Spindle Splintered by Alix E. Harrow, and that they're all taking very well-established fairy tale ideas and subverting them in various ways, and using them as a lens to look at childhood illness, to look at depression, to look at real things that people experience on a day-to-day level. So I kind of love the fact that these 3 works are all on the short list, and that in some ways they're all in conversation with the same things and approach them so very differently.
Juan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was engaged with the story. I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I've been hearing the author's name for years. For my club, every January, I put out a list of recommended book readings, and I do it through researching lists and other sources of it. And for the last 3 years, Adrian Tchaikovsky has made it on the list of a book that I recommended. And this is kind of and it's taken him this long to finally get, a Hugo nomination. So that was a big surprise. I like the idea of the book. That idea appeals to me. It kind of reminds me of the classic Doctor Who story, Face of Evil, about an abandoned colony. And, the doctor comes along and tries to solve the problem with a modern point of view. And that kind of intrigued me. And, it's mixed up with your traditional quest narrative. This talk also reminded me about something, because I read it at the end of May and I forgot about the DCS, which is very I can see that being appealing. I also see the negative parts of it, but it's kind of interesting of how they're talking about, should you use it, should you not use it? Because I was listening to a podcast about Trek, and they pointed out in the 60s, they were always ganging up on Spock on, Spock, emotions will get us through the day. We can't just rely on cold logic. And to a certain extent, that debate is kind of resurrected with the use or disuse of the DCS machine in this book. So those are the points I wanted to put out.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gretchen.
2 things. One, I wanted to note that this is one of the few examples on this list where there isn't a romance by the end of the story, which I found really interesting. I love a good romance. I'm a big fan. I don't think that they add or detract from stories. I just thought I found it interesting. And I didn't realize how much I appreciated it until the end of the book, that I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, he didn't feel the need to put any of these characters together, which is fine. Like that, I think that the story had so much else going on with it. If you hear a weird scratching noise, I apologize. My cat is trying to get into my office and she's very insistent. But anyway, yeah, I liked that he didn't feel the need, like any pressure to like create a romance in the story, that the story was allowed to exist without that. Again, nothing wrong with romance. I love romances. 2 of my favorite books, 2 of my 2 favorite novels for the Hugos this year each have a romance on them. She Who Became the Sun and Desolation Called Peace. So, I mean, I love it. I just think that this story worked really well without it, especially because part of Near's perspective was that he was perceiving Linnes through the lens of her like great grandmother or whoever it was, who he had known and had another adventure with. And I think I liked that that Adrian Tchaikovsky used that as a lens to like enhance the idea of miscommunicating, that Nier kept consistently having to remind himself, Linus is not her ancestor. I can't perceive her through that lens, but he kept trying to, like, he instinctively, because they looked so similar and it was a similar situation, kept trying to impose his past knowledge of her ancestor on Linessa's behavior and perspective, and then had to remind himself, nope, that's not who this is, and was struggling with that. And I think that that works really well as a way to talk about how we as humans do the same thing. And it's not necessarily that people look similar, but we encounter a situation that's like, oh, this feels like this other situation I've experienced. I have to remind myself not to impose that experience onto what's happening now. And I thought that worked well. And I just really liked that these characters were allowed to like just have an adventure together, and that like he didn't feel the need to add that extra complicating layer.
Agree
the other
so
thing
wholeheartedly.
Yeah. I also wanted to bring up, Rob, you had a really good comment like back in our text thread that I wanted to bring up about that neither viewpoint character's perspective is complete. So at times we have to put together what's actually going on, and we're also constantly asking, how did what Lynn or Nier experience look to the other character? Which really is a really interesting way to get us to question narrative perspective without making the narrator unreliable. And it's so unique. I feel like I rarely ever see science fiction and fantasy stories do this, where they get you to think about narrative perspective, not from the lens of this character is not a reliable narrator of their own experience, but rather these characters are reliable narrators of their own experience. They are consistently perceiving talking about the world in the way they perceive them. But because we have two such different perspectives, we realize that each of them is a reliable narrator of their experience, but that experience is mediated through their language and their culture. And so that's what makes the narrative experience incomplete, is that we recognize that language, culture, background, history are influencing how these characters experience their own reality, even though they are accurately reflecting when they narrate what that reality is to them. And we see that so rarely. And I really love that about this story.
Yeah, that's a great point. Go ahead, Rob.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that into the podcast. Yeah, it was one of those things about how the story works and how this particular story worked anyhow. I also wanted to mention one other thing, that sometimes in stories like this, it's easy to default to the idea that the person with the highest tech is the one with the most privileged knowledge, the one with the quote unquote best perspective. But there's one point where they're discussing the nature of demons, and Nier the anthropologist is asking Linus what is a demon from her point of view, and she tries to characterize it, and he's trying to ask questions about it, and she said it's, and it distinguishes it from a monster, which is like a material thing you can fight, and which they've encountered a number of those, including, many of these creations of this demon antagonist. But she says, no, it's from outside. And then he says, like, do you mean like from the sky? And he's thinking like, is it an off-planet thing? And she said, no, from outside. And this, in a way, turns out to be closer to what the actual nature of the antagonist than what anything that Nier was thinking up to that point. And I found it interesting that she was ahead of him there, and it, it did kind of puncture that that preconceived notion that the one with the highest tech is the one with the most savvy about the situation.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Go ahead, Olaf.
Speaking of the demon, I mean avoiding talking about the demon because of spoilers, but I almost wondered if that was another level of the technology being indistinguishable from magic, because that is a layer of technology that even Nier doesn't get.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I also, this is just me speculating, but is the demon what actually destroyed Earth and the civilization that Nier came from?
Yeah, it's a good question. Go ahead, Trish.
Yeah, since we're talking about this, when we got to the demon and saw what it is, that's a very good point. But it was also making me think of any number of cosmic horror works where unreality or other reality intrudes on what we think is reality. A more recent book on those lines is The Outside by Ada Hoffman, where you have just patches of difference, different reality impinging on patches of the world that humans know. So that was the twist that really surprised me, because I was expecting it to be more, old tech that had run amok or was being misused by someone. And no, it's something completely different. Of course, there's it also goes back to the translation thing, because, he feels like these things are trying to talk to him and corrupt them. Well, it is basically, although that entity probably doesn't think of it as corruption, it's just growth or something, in this wonderful new petri dish. But they're along, perhaps some way in the future there could be a dialogue if they could find a way of talking to this creature instead of just being eaten by it or attacking it.
Yeah. Anything else about Elder Race? All right, let's go ahead and move on to The Past is Red. And Juan, you're kicking that one off.
Okay. I'll be reading from a brief that I did earlier this year.
Okay.
Tetley Abedengo lives in Garbage Town, a garbage heap in the Pacific. Due to something she did, Tetley is ostracized from her community. She's taken to Pilltown, where she's offered peace and acceptance. On the journey, she discovers an AI. What will she learn from the AI, and the journey and how will the journey change Tetley and the world forever? I like it because the story shows that despite hardships, horrors, and apocalypse, there's still hope. And although I reread the last part of it, or some of my favorite bits yesterday, I found out there was one error. But I'll let other people talk about it, because it's a very nitpicky thing. But I think it was a great story. I'm a big fan of Cat Valente. I didn't read the first part, but obviously she combined the prequel story to this story and made it one big book and put it in there. I did read it in book form from my local library, because I just wanted to get some novellas under my belt. A very good, very engaging. I like how she's able to hack the AI, and I think Catherynne said in the acknowledgments she was trying to figure out what universal parts of pop culture we would have, and I think as a fellow Xer, you can never go wrong with Sesame Street.
Yeah, and you mentioned this is expanded out from the Future is Blue, I think, which was a novelette that was also nominated, or maybe it wasn't.
I don't think the novelette. I don't remember if it was. I don't know. I would have read it. I don't think it was nominated.
Yeah,
but it was. But the thing is, she put the novelette in the book, and it goes, and then we jump into the main part of the section, which is The Past is Red.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olaf.
I have to admit that her work often leaves me cold. But this, I actually thought more highly of than I usually do. I thought the world building was fabulous. You know, the giant trash patch that they're on. It's just like, it's just wonderful world building. The one thing, and this is becoming more and more of a trend, it bothers me. Polysyndeton and the overuse of polysyndeton as a rhetorical technique kind of gets to me. You know, it gives writing a breathless feel. What polysyndeton is when you've got a string of clauses, and instead of doing comma, comma, and, you end up with and. So imagine having so much time, so much energy to spare after finding food and shelter and clothing and some tiny goddamn scrap of company. That's from this novelette. It's that instead of finding food, shelter, and clothing, it's food and shelter and clothing, and it just has a breathless feel. And I feel like that really takes me out of this work. And I'm sorry to nitpick, but I'm finding a lot of writers using that on strings of clauses.
Trish, go ahead.
I thought that the kind of breathless quality and just verbal going on and on seemed very true to the character. This is an uneducated person who just, you know, well, school of life, but obviously not formal schooling. I will say I found this book hard to read, this novella hard to read. Generally, you know, I would read 10 or 15 pages and then have to stop because it is a little hard to swallow the writing style. And also the subject matter is hard because it's such an awful dystopia, even though she's happy in it. So I had to keep putting it down, partly because of the content and partly because of the style. But that doesn't mean to me that the style is bad. It seemed very true to her experience. It seemed to come out of how she lived. And so I didn't see it as a drawback. I certainly agree that it made it a little hard to read.
Yeah. I actually, because I wasn't going to be able to get to all of these in print, I did this one on audio, and it's an absolutely fantastic audiobook from Audible. I'll throw it over to Scott because I figure that's how you took it too.
Yeah. No, this one is Penelope Rollins is the narrator on this and does an outstanding job of really bringing Tetley to life. I listened to all that have an audiobook for these, obviously, but this one in particular, I think the audiobook really even raises it up a level because of that. And so, you know, maybe some of that writing may work better where it's narrated versus in the print. I can definitely see that aspect of it. You know, overall though, I agree with everything that's been said. I really love this one. This was my favorite. Just the turns of phrase that she brings in here, the naming of the different things, and then just bringing in so many of the little details and the perspective on things. You know, from the Oscar to Grouch, or you know, the scene where she comes across all the old trophies, and you know, just love some of those little scenes, and just the way that she has this relentless optimism in what we would, as has been said, would look at as a dystopia, and she's really looking at it as, hey, this is the perfect world. What are you talking about? I don't know what everybody's doing. And it's a really it's really interesting. There's a lot of different kind of obviously issues that you can think about and focus on, whether it's the environmental impacts. Obviously, there's also not to get too spoilers, but there's different levels of inequality and how that's dealt with in interesting ways. But yeah, no, I love this one, and it is one that if the print didn't quite work for you, I would definitely recommend considering listening to the audio.
Yeah. Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, this one was my favorite. I love this one. And I feel like Catherynne and Valente's prose style is extremely divisive. I know a lot of people that just refuse to read anything short because they just can't stand her prose. But I adore her prose. I think it's so unique and kind of edgy, and it's just really different. Like I don't know anyone else that writes this way. And I like the way that she takes obscure words and metaphors and put things together that people don't normally would put together. It works so well for me. It really tickles my fancy. And I really liked how I loved the world building. The world building was amazing. And I really liked the main character. Several of you have mentioned how she's relentlessly optimistic, and she reminded me a lot of Candide, just that we live in the best of all possible worlds. And, we should just be happy and accept that this is our life and be happy about it and try to look on the good side. And I through all that, like, she succeeds, and it makes her very sympathetic. And I really liked her a lot. And I would also say, I know some people that chose not to read this novella because they did not like the novelette that comprises the first half. But I would say that for me personally, I actually enjoyed the second half more than the first half. So still give it a chance if you didn't like The Future is Blue, because where she went when the second half just really upped it a level for me. I was in the beginning, it wasn't totally working for me. I wasn't sure if I liked it. Like, I liked the prose, I liked the world building, but there was kind of some stuff, like there's just a lot of cruelty that I was having a hard time kind of stomaching, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. I was a little confused about some aspects of the world building, but then the second half it completely won me over. I was in love. I was so sad when it ended. I wanted to keep reading. By the time I got to the end of this book, I wanted more. So definitely give like the whole book a chance.
Yeah. I thought it was really skillfully done, the way it kind of would imply something early in the book and then come back to that later. Like the whole "thank you for my correction" or education or whatever it was thing. I was like, what is going on with that? And when we finally got the story, I'm like, okay, I get that. Go ahead, Cora.
Well, I'm probably going to be digressing about it a bit because I had very mixed feelings about this one. One thing I love, Catherynne Valente is a very good writer, and I know some people have issues with her prose style. I've also had issues with some of her stories in the past. I didn't really have issues with the prose in this one, and I loved the world building, the buildings, the different neighborhoods, like the one where there's only candles, or the batteries and pill boxes and whatever. I love the fact that the people name themselves after bits of garbage they find. Tetley is named after Tetley tea, and her brother Maru-chan is named after cup noodles. Noodles. These were all things I enjoyed a lot. Another thing I really loved is that Tetley grows up and her brother grow up in the aftermath of the apocalypse, in what we would say a terribly post-apocalyptic and dystopian world, but they're happy. And I can relate to this because I did grow up in the aftermath of what was an apocalypse. I grew up in Germany, was born in the early 70s when when there was still, as a child, I still saw some World War II ruins around. Mostly they were hidden behind billboards. But you still had a lot of older people who couldn't shut up about the war, and especially people who'd been living in Silesia or Eastern Prussia and so on, who had lost their home, and they kept going on about, oh, my lost home, and it was so wonderful. And I said, like, okay, but it was like 20 years, 30 years ago. No one cares anymore. So yeah, I can relate to this, like growing up in what some people think is the aftermath of an apocalypse, and saying like, okay, yeah, but let me go on with my life, please. I don't really care about Eastern Prussia. It's gone. Gone. Will never come back. Yeah. It's not gone, obviously. It's half Poland, half Russia right now. Right now, but I can totally relate to this, and those were the things I liked. But now about the things I did not like, because a lot of this simply like stretched my suspension of disbelief to the breaking point.
Hmm.
Okay, so the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is quite well researched. We know what floats around there, and batteries don't float. Batteries are heavier than, batteries don't float. Also tea bags. Unless there are some fancy tea bags which have some, which is, I have no idea why they do this, which have some kind of synthetic fiber. But tea bags are paper. Tea bags decay. They don't survive to end up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Most of what actually floats around, there are a lot of lost fishing nets because they're from things. And there is plastic garbage. The Maruchan noodles actually make sense because this is the sort of garbage you would find there. But also the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is huge, but it floats. But let's say it's okay. But we can say if everything sinks under the water surface, then it's then maybe we'll have enough to actually have people living on there. Then this was in the prequel. My edition had the prequel story included, where Brighton Pier comes to visit. Now Brighton Pier is in southern England. It is actually it gets badly damaged by storms. I'm not sure if they have actually that's more than one Brighton Pier. One is basically completely damaged. The other one still exists, and it's a wooden structure. It's over 100 years old, and there's no way this thing would survive floating to the Pacific. And also, even if every bit of ice on the planet melts, it's not as if all dry land would be gone. So a lot of dry land would be gone, but not all of it. A lot of these things just broke my suspension of disbelief. And also, I found it a bit, especially the thing at the end, and the person she contacts via the AI. I found it a bit on the nose. Okay, Olaf is really eager to say something.
We're willing to suspend our disbelief for people being teleported instantly, running around on a starship and fighting with Dracula on an alien planet. I think we can give some poetic license here for Cat Valente to have floating batteries. That's not less likely than Kirk and Spock fighting Dracula. Or fighting alongside Abe Lincoln. Like these are things that we suspend our disbelief for. And I think it's worth giving Cat this poetic license to tell this fable, because she's talking about some real issues in our disposable society, right? Like I as I said, like there are things that bothered me in this book, but overall I thought it was really good, and it kept bringing to mind a song which I've posted in the chat. If anybody's familiar with the band Charlift, they did a song called Garbage, and the first two lines are, all the garbage that you have thrown away is waiting somewhere a million miles away. And just throwing that out there.
Nice. Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, yeah. I really like this one a lot too. I think it's it may be my favorite thing of at least of Valente's work that's been nominated for Hugos or Nebulas that I've read so far, although I may need to go back and reread some of the others. It is interesting that prose style. This is another one that I read very close before deadline for discussion here, and I probably would have had the same trouble as some others reading it, having put down every 10-15 pages or so, if I had not been on a deadline to finish it. It is, very breathless prose style. It suits the character well, while acknowledging, the character, even though Tetley is very lovable in a lot of ways, she can be a bit much. And even without I mean, it's, although obviously, you know, we as readers feel a lot more sympathy toward her punishment in the first part of the story,
Yeah.
than anybody else around does. And it is interesting that she herself is not quite a reliable narrator, that she even acknowledges making some stuff up during part of her story and then telling us how it actually went instead. And I thought, you know, the gradual revelation of the tattoos or whatever that people were getting with the 2 X's and then some words between them, you know, that the revelation of what that meant, that was, it was startling and kind of depressing at the same time. And especially, you know, because some of them related specifically to Tetley herself. I thought the relationship with Goodnight Moon was very interesting, although both of them, I think, misunderstood each other to the end. I think, although I think Tetley had Goodnight Moon's number more than he understood her. And it is interesting. I mean, it really does confront you with your own perspective. I mean, you know, references the people around today. You know, we've been kind of dancing around the term that used, and which I might as well just say FWs, where W stands for wit, as in, you know, capacity for thought, and F stands pretty much what you think it does. You know, that we all, you know, that every one of us in this discussion and everyone watching or listening to it fits into that. You know, that's all of us.
Right.
But, and it's interesting, you know, by the end, it's clear that that perspective on things hasn't yet gone, you know, that desire for the material stuff, for the good life, that the good life can only come from the manufactured stuff and not just from, you know, the stuff around you that you happen upon or that comes your way. It does kind of draws you into questioning that that materialistic, that particular, that not just the materialistic, but industrial driven materialistic perspective, I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Trish.
Yeah, without I want to talk about something with the revelation toward the end, but I don't want to spoil it, so I'm a little unclear how to get to there. Instead, back to the suspension of disbelief, I had no problem at all with it. It may have been taken a little far, but, you know, I can just as easily imagine it being people on islands living among trash heaps and going out and scavenging whatever they can from the float as just living on the garbage patch. But I think it's a very important story. I got a lot out of it. I was thinking a lot at the ending about certain people today who want to escape the Earth and go to Mars instead of solving the problems that we have to deal with here on Earth, as if that's going to be easier to just escape and start new than actually solving or alleviating even some of the problems here. Not really understanding how complex systems are and societies are. So I was thinking a lot about that and about the narrative that a character in the story was saying, blaming everything on the people who had been left behind, when to me, it seemed far more likely that this character was one, of a group or a descendant of a group that had caused a lot of the problems in the first place and then run away instead of trying to solve them. So I was thinking a lot about that, about the narratives that people tell themselves, and, maybe he believed that. Maybe that's what his parents told him, that the people left behind were the ones to blame instead of their own. People do definitely construct their own narratives and misplace the blame. Yeah, it's parts of this story are terribly depressing because of the dystopian aspects, and even people who tried to leave are finding their own problems. And maybe there's hope in that. Maybe the groups can eventually get together and figure out how to help each other. Maybe not, but I was really impressed with this story, with the imagination, with the world building, as others have said, with the picturing ways that people would scramble around and try to survive. And it's right up there with Elder Race for me. I'm having a real hard time deciding which one to vote number one.
Nice. Go ahead, Gretchen.
Yeah, I just want to agree with everyone here. I really liked the world building. I think that was one of the strongest elements of the story, if not the strongest. And I think overall in the novellas, one of the strongest examples of world building that we have. Like, I think Cat Valente really dedicated herself to the world building here. I struggled with a bit with her prose, and I've struggled with it in other places. I don't know, it might be my ADHD. I feel like there are times where it's just not friendly to sometimes to neurodivergent brains. Like I get very distracted and confused, and I find myself having to reread sentences because the way that she phrases things isn't always as straightforward as it could be. And that's probably a personal struggle. But one thing that I do really appreciate her, and I think in all of her stories, even the ones that I struggle to read because of my brain problems, is that Cat Valente is angry, and Cat Valente is honest, and Cat Valente is looking at systems and figuring out what is wrong with them and very clearly articulating in story form the problems of classism and capitalism and sexism and misogyny. Like in each of the nominations this year for novelette and short story and now novella, she's addressing one of those systems and looking at it very clearly and honestly and saying, this is what is wrong, and this is what could happen, and this is what it does to people that are in those systems. And even when I struggle to read her prose, I deeply appreciate that she's willing to be honest and willing to get angry about it. And put that in her work, is not afraid to say, like, this is a problem. This is bad, you guys. Like, we should be upset by this. And the way she writes, I think you can read that she is upset. And I think it is written to make us feel the same thing. Like, she is writing to evoke a dissatisfaction with the systems that are hurting these characters. And that is something that, like, I really just appreciate about her. And I think that that's a big part of why she's resonating so much with so many people, is that she's doing that and she has that voice. And I think that I would like to, see more of that in current science fiction and fantasy, just that element of like honest anger at, the injustices that we're looking at in the world.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cora.
About the suspension of disbelief. I have to admit, I know maybe a little. I know I've been doing translation work, and I know people who work in garbage, who have worked in waste processing and also waste recovery and recycling. I know people who've worked in in the environmental industry and cleaning up water and so on. So I know a bit about this, and this is probably why I have issues suspending my disbelief. Also, my expectations are different. When I watch Star Trek, I will accept, okay, they can teleport. This makes no sense, but they can do it. And there are things at Star Trek where I say, okay, nope, this is too much occasionally. Or when I watch Star Wars, I'm okay with the fact that these people have lightsabers and psychic powers, and that a lot of, so I adjust my world building. My problem maybe was this one, that I when I opened it up, I hadn't read it before, and I thought, okay, this is going to be a serious novella about climate change and global warming and the problem and the environmental issues, and this is probably the mindset with which I read it, and this is when the issues showed up there. Actually, this is a lot. This is why I don't read a lot of books about climate change or climate fiction, because a lot of them always is something like, okay, sorry, but that makes no sense, and it breaks my sense of disbelief. So I usually only see this genre whenever something shows up on the Hugo ballot. I mean, it's I did like it. It's not a wind-up girl, which I bloody hated, or the other one, Shipbreaker, which I hated even more than the wind-up girl. It's a good story. It's just okay. This is my personal thing, that sometimes something, even if it's small for other people, will break my sense of my suspension of disbelief.
Alrighty, Juan, you mentioned in the chat you've got one nitpicky thing you wanted to say, and also I wanted to apologize that I went out of order. You weren't ready to go. It was Gretchen's turn, and I scrolled too far on my list. So go ahead, Juan.
No worries. In fact, I'm surprised you told it. That's why I sent it as a private message. Anyway, no, there was one nitpicky, but I will say one thing about the systems of this, your suspension of disbelief. She did ask in the acknowledgements, yes, I know garbage patches cannot right now support the weight of a human being, but hey, maybe in the future. I mean, she did ask an indulgence on that part. So she did ask, that's why I always like reading the acknowledgements, because we'll say, well, I did this research and it says, yeah, it could happen. So, and I kind of accept that. Then, and I hate to be nitpicky about this thing, but the thing is, I've been watching For All Mankind, and they've been good on this, and I can't believe she missed this. But unfortunately, as we know, and spoiler for those of you who are not spoiled already, she makes contact with the Mars colony, or a child on the Mars colony, we should say. But she didn't forget that there's a 2-minute delay. So you either have to maybe they don't mention a 2-minute delay. They are pausing, and she's not writing a pause on it.
Right.
Or maybe somehow we figured out some way to go faster than the speed of light. When the AI finds, is able to communicate, hook up with the relay, which lets her communicate with Mars. But to me, that's very important, because it just because it seems like, the Martians thought everybody died back on Earth. So now it gives the impression, that's the hope that I see that the story has. And yes, there are definite problems. These kids are living horrible lives, but there's hope that, hey, wait a minute. This kid now made contact with people who had written them off, and maybe said, wait a minute, maybe we should start thinking maybe we can help the people we left behind now that we're kind of stable, because it appears the Martian colony has been stable for a while, and maybe they can help it. So, and that's what I want to leave, because that's a stupid nitpicky, but it was on my mind, because if you're watching For All Mankind, we have humans on Mars, and they are thinking about that there's a short 2-minute delay between radio time with Mars.
Yeah, and that's variable too, because depending on the orbits of Earth and Mars, it could be more than that. All right, why don't we go ahead and move on to Fireheart Tiger, because we are halfway through and 2 hours in, and I don't really want to go 4 hours, so we'll try and be more brisk on the back half of this. So Gretchen, you're leading off that conversation.
Okay. I am going to read a spoiler-free recap that is from Aliette de Bodard's own website for this description of Fireheart Tiger. Quiet, thoughtful Princess Than was sent away as a hostage to the powerful faraway country of Etheria as a child. Now she's returned to her mother's imperial court, haunted not only by memories of her first romance, but by worrying magical echoes of a fire that devastated Efteria's royal palace. Than's new role as a diplomat places her once again in the path of her first love, the powerful and magnetic Eldris of Epteria, who knows exactly what she wants, romance from Than and much more from Than's home. Eldris won't take no for an answer on either front, but the fire that burned down one palace is tempting Than with the possibility of making her own dangerous decisions. Can Than find the freedom to shape her country's fate and her own? The things I appreciated most about this story, I really liked the depth of characterization for the main character, the exploration of the various layers of feeling trapped, both by the geopolitical situation and the encroaching colonialist empire, as well as trapped by expectations, and like trapped in this potentially dangerous relationship that has some overtones of like controlling and abusive. Which, relates to her relationship with her mother, which is complicated and fraught, and has its own layers of, emotional manipulation and expectation. I found myself really relating to Than, having grown up in like a similar, very complicated household with a lot of expectations and feeling trapped and kind of unable initially to see different, like a way out. That like being constrained by your environment to only see certain kinds of options. And I really like that the story is about exploring how Than can find ways to, be creative, to have some imagination about the way out, both geopolitically and in her relationship with her mother and in her relationship, romantic relationship with Eldris. I liked the world building. I'm really, really into the explosion of South Asian inspired fantasy fantasy and science fiction that we're seeing in the last few years. So I really liked that this has got like a Vietnamese, pre-colonial Vietnamese style setting. Let's see, I think there was another one just like that. Yeah. The fraught emotional conflict between characters. I think Aliette de Bodard really excels in creating scenes where characters have conflicting desires and motivations and having them talk to each other and learn how to communicate. And sometimes they communicate past each other. And there's a lot of confrontations between characters, emotionally fraught, complicated confrontations between characters in this story. And I think that is one of Aliette de Bodard's strengths, is generating scenes in which they feel real and in which those conflicts feel like they have, strong emotional stakes. And I deeply appreciated that about her. And it's sapphic. And as a queer person, I always appreciate reading more queer stories in science fiction and fantasy. That's another thing I really like that we're seeing a lot of. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing what other people thought.
Well, I have to give this story credit. First of all, the cover art is absolutely stunning, by Alyssa Winans, and it's on my ballot because she's fantastic.
Yeah, that professional artist is one of the nominees, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. And I have to give the book credit as well for proper use of the word nauseous. We tend to use nauseous when we mean nauseated, when what it means is something that causes nausea. And it uses it correctly. Like words won't come. There's just a sharp, nauseous heaving, squeezing the breath out of her.
Nice.
I like properly used words. Go ahead, Olaf.
Well, I thought the central relationship of this book was really superb. I think it's one of the most well drawn out relationships in a novella this year. I did feel that the characters, and I'm sorry that I'm blanking on the names of the two.
Than and Eldris.
An and Eldris.
Than,
yes.
yeah.
Other than those two, I did feel most of the characters were fairly thinly drawn. It's interesting mentally for me to compare the way Aliette de Bodard writes with how Seanan does, because I like how both of them write, but they are very different in their approaches. And I find Aliette is far more intentional with her passages and her metaphors and her attempts to evoke emotion through the richness of language. And I really appreciate that in her work. I should note that Aliette de Bodard is second only to Michael Burstein, Michael A. Burstein, in terms of number of Hugo appearances on a Hugo shortlist in a prose category without having yet won. I'm fairly certain that to date, Aliette has 9 Hugo nods without having won.
Wow.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Cora.
I enjoyed this. I mean, I generally enjoy pretty much everything Aliette de Bodard writes, and I'm not surprised that she keeps getting nominated for Hugos. I'm a bit surprised that she hasn't won yet, but I generally enjoy everything, and I enjoyed this one a lot. It's currently my number 2. I enjoyed the world building, and also I very much enjoyed the complex relationship between San and Eldris, and also, and this is something that also happens in, I'm blanking on the name now, but it came out, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. It was a short novel by Aliette de Bodard. Bodard didn't make the Hugo ballot, but it made the long list. It was a subterranean novel, and it had a similar setup about how the one with the dragon and the scholar. I hate it, I can't remember the title now, but it had a similar setup interrogating about if there's a huge power differential between 2 people who like each other. In this case, San, who first met Eldris and had a relationship with her when she was a hostage and prisoner, basically, and Eldris was a member of the ruling family who had imprisoned her. And Aliette de Bodard's interrogating is a romantic relationship, a consensual romantic relationship, even possible under such circumstances. This is something I like a lot, because this is not a subject that SFF or even the romance genre. I mean, a lot of romances have captivity romance is a thing, sadly, or it used to be more of a thing, but it still is a thing. So, and there's a dark romance and so on. So I like it that Aliette de Bodard interrogates these relationships and how consensual they can be when there's such a huge power differential between the 2 characters involved. And yes, and the fact that it's a lesbian couple is another great thing, because mostly we see relationships with huge power differentials in heterosexual couple where the man has all the power and the woman has none. So it's nice to see this interrogated via 2 women, where we usually think this is a more equal relationship, except that it's not in this case. Oh yes, 7 of Infinities. No, that's not the one I was thinking of because Juan said I would have to look it up. It was a great, at any rate, it had a similar setup, and was also by Aliette de Bodard.
Go ahead, Rob.
I pretty much just wanted to basically just echoing Cora's point about interrogating, some of the natures of the romance in this type of story, and the power imbalances, and the whole idea of having to be rescued by the handsome prince or the handsome princess, whichever, and but then also kind of turning that on its head and learning how to rescue oneself seemed to really be the point of this one.
Yeah.
And it was echoing, like that theme was echoed in the colonial the negotiations happening between this kind of smaller, there's a huge power differential in the geopolitical situation as well, that Than is reflecting. She is both a representative of being having less power in a relationship, and also from a country that has less geopolitical power, and Eldris represents both of those things. And those pressures are interconnected in really interesting ways. I thought it was really interesting to compare Than to, say, Linnes in Elder Race, because they're both younger daughters that are in a position where their parents seems to not think highly of them, seems to think of them as rather extraneous, and they're in a position where they're trying to earn their parents' approval by pursuing kind of their own quest in a particular way. And I I mean, there's superficial similarities. One thing that I liked about Aliette de Bodard is I think that she captured a lot more of Than's interiority than Adrian Tchaikovsky necessarily did with Linnes. I feel like I got a really good sense of Nier as a character in Elder Race. And it wasn't until like I started thinking about Fireheart Tiger that I was like, I don't feel like I got as much out of Linnes, at least compared to, say, a character like Than, who is under very similar pressures.
Yeah.
And really feeling how much she wants to both live up to her mother's expectations, but also try to do things her own way. And there's a really deep internal conflict for Than that I don't necessarily see as reflected in Elder Race, which, you know, like they're just different stories, they're different writers, but it was interesting to compare the two because I feel like it gave me a sense of like what I could have maybe gotten a little bit more of from Adrian Tchaikovsky in terms of Linnes. The only, like, one of the big drawbacks about this story is I think it could have been longer. I think that some of, you know, what you were talking about, Olav, with like the sketchiness of the secondary characters, they're not as fully fleshed out. I think this story could have been 30 or even 50 pages longer. It was only 100 pages, and that's on the shorter end for novellas. And I feel like it could have been longer, and that would have created more space to develop Gyang, for example. I don't want to do spoilers, but there's a character named Gyang, and she does not get a whole lot of development. And there's a rich mind there as another character who feels trapped, and potentially seen as someone who's only exists to be used by the people around her for power. And I feel like we could have gotten much more from that character than we did. And I wish it would have been longer. Like I got to the end of it and I was like, that's it. Okay. I feel like it could have gotten more from this, and it would have developed those secondary characters to a more satisfying way.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olaf.
And it's funny, talking about that power imbalance between characters from differing cultures. That's, again, a theme that was in A Memory Called Empire. And I felt Memory Called Empire was superb in its exploration of that. And it's kind of why I felt gutted by the sequel. Like the sequel takes that incredibly satisfying ending of the first novel and goes, the fans love the relationship between Mahit and Three Seagrass, so I have to put them back together, even though like Mahit's heartbreaking decision at the end of that first novel really felt like a satisfying way to resolve that power imbalance. That, you know, she's asked to make a choice, and it's a heartbreaking choice. And to me, that was actually the central question in Memory Called Empire was, does this character stay true to her own culture, or does she take the subordinate position in her relationship? And she has enough self-confidence and self-esteem to make the hard choice. So undoing that, like, just it's like, sorry, I could rant about this and it's off topic.
But you're right to point that out. And that's also it's also an element of Adrian Tchaikovsky's story with Elder Race, is that the relationship between cultures where one might be, well, technologically superior, but he's alone, but still there's still a kind of power differential happening with Nier and Lynn. I don't think Adrian isn't as interested in that specific power dynamic as he is about the communication barrier. But yeah, I think you're right to bring up Memory Called Empire, because that is another one where you have a relationship between a potential colony and, you know, so a member from a potential colony and a member from the empire, and whether or not romance is even possible in that, whether or not an equal relationship is ever possible. I think that Desolation is partly about examining Three Seagrasses, is about Three Seagrass coming to understand that she is that she would need to change in order for the relationship to work, because she is from the empire, and is about her questioning, or at least coming to see that she has a perspective that she hasn't questioned. And that has assumed that she is superior precisely because she's from Texcalan. And that was, was not examined at all in the first book. But I do see your point. I can definitely see why that might feel unsatisfying to put them back together. Because Mahit does make a pretty devastating and powerful choice that's very similar to the one that Don ends up making, which is to say, this relationship doesn't actually serve me, and I would rather have a relationship where I feel equal or none at all than to have one where I am consistently in a subservient position, in a way that reflects both the geopolitical situation and her situation with her mother. Don's relationship with her mother is one of subservience, where she is trapped by only being able to perform in specific ways, and has to kind of push back against that as well. So I think that's an apt comparison.
Anything else on this one? All right, let's go ahead and move on to A Psalm for the Wild Built. And Scott, you're leading that one off.
Yes. So A Psalm for the Wild Built is set on Panga, which formerly had a heavy industrial society that was reliant on robots. And one day, several hundred years prior to the events of the story, robots developed consciousness and decided to essentially go off and find themselves separate from humanity and what their identity was as a collective, if you will. And this also prompted humanity to relook its social structures and relationship to the environment. And the story really focuses on sibling Dex, who is a monk who is in the process of changing their vocation from garden monk to tea monk, and we kind of see that struggle. And on Panga, a tea monk kind of travels around between towns offering tea, and it's kind of an opportunity for relaxation, informal therapy, and a nice beverage. Side note: I would love to have tea monks around. We can all use that, I think. Very relatable. And after initially struggling in that transition to becoming a tea monk, but eventually they master this new calling, but still kind of feels this nagging of something's still kind of missing. And as a result, attempts to travel to a remote hermitage that had kind of been abandoned prior for some self-reflection. And it's really on this journey that Splendid Speckled Mosscap, who is a robot, introduces itself to sibling Dex. And this is the first intentional contact between humans and robots in a generation. And they kind of get to explore. And I will just say, Becky Chambers is just a master, I think, of kind of cozy and thoughtful stories. And certainly we saw it with Wayfarers. And this series definitely continues with this. It is, I really enjoy and she said it as well, science fantasy world building, because this is also in that category of, don't think about too much of how this is. Becky Chambers has said, Panga exists because I say so, and just accept that. And go from there. And I really like the themes of kind of exploring and finding purpose and self-exploration, even when sibling Dex is in a position where their life is objectively not that bad, and really the entire society, they've gotten, humanity has gotten to a point where life is really not that bad at all, but that doesn't automatically solve all issues and self-reflection. So yeah, I'll let others chime in. I may have more to say later, but really love this one.
Yeah, the thing that I like about this is just the kind of twist on the robot uprising, where instead of it being, the Skynet kind of version of it, it's no, we're just going to go over here and do our own thing, and maybe eventually we'll make contact again. But not much of that has happened at this point. And I was trying to write down a review for this one. I'm like, I guess the message is sometimes you just need a weird friend to make tea for you. Go ahead, Rob.
I really, really like this one a lot. I've been kind of reluctant to get into Becky Chambers because she only really crossed my radar with the third book in the Wayfarers series. And I've read the first one, Long Way to the Small Angry Planet. I haven't read the others yet, but I've enjoyed all that one and all the other stuff I've read from her. To Be Taught If Fortunate, which would have had my vote for the Hugo when that came out. And this one is really very good too. Very much hopeful and everything. And interesting thinking about it in comparison to some of these others. Speckled, Spangled, or the Mosscap is not as, is very much an optimistic character, sort of in the same way Tetley is, although not as intense about it, but again, can be a little much when it gets, I assume, it is the pronoun it uses for itself, right? So can get preoccupied with doing its own trail of thought. And it's interesting also to Dex with Near from Elder Race. Both are struggling. I don't think Dex could be described as classically depressed, but there's something, some sort of issue there with him that, feeling incomplete somehow, feeling a hole in him. Yeah, I see that video stuff. I don't know what's going on with that. I'm sorry. My computer may be trying to do too much at once. Anyway, this is a real enjoyable one, and I'm looking forward to the next book in the series, the Prayer for the Crown Shy, which I think is just out, and I've got it on hold at the library. So anyway, we'll see. I like this one a lot.
With your video going on there, I keep expecting you to say, "My God, it's full of stars."
Oh, yeah, that would be apt. I'm going to turn it off again and turn it back on and see what happens.
Sounds good. Go ahead, Lori.
So I really enjoyed this one. This one will be at the top of my ballot. And I want to briefly plug, if you don't mind, Scott's podcast, Narrated. Scott and Lisa had a great discussion about the audiobook of this and of the sequel, A Prayer for the Crown Shy. So I am looking forward to reading that based on your discussion. But I really loved this. I like the juxtaposition of sibling Dex, who is just experiencing a lot of ennui. Nothing is really making them happy. Nothing makes them satisfied, even though all of their basic needs are met. And they're searching for something with Mosscap, who's, forgive me, but Mosscap is just like so cute. The name is cute. The character is cute. And I love the sense of wonder that the character has in contrast to Dex. Mosscap is like, I saw a bird today. It's almost like Elf when he's like, guess what? I saw a dog today. It's kind of like that. So I enjoyed that character a lot, and I like them together. And the thing that I really wanted to mention that drew me in on this story is that when Dex decides, I don't want to be a garden monk anymore, I want to be a tea monk, and they get their little tea caravan set up, and they have all these opportunities for mentoring that they turn down. And I'm not really sure why they do. I'm not sure that they're sure why they do. They're just like, no, I want to do what I want to do, and I'm going to do it my way. So they get everything all set up, and then they look at it and they're like, what do I do now? And that is exactly how I felt. I graduated law school right at 12 years ago and took the bar exactly 12 years ago. And I remember starting my first job, and I had my diploma, and I had registered with the bar, and I had my bar license number, and I had my little suit from TJ Maxx. And I was like, now what do I do? How do I know what I'm supposed to be doing here? So I just deeply identified with that. And I wish that Dex had maybe made a different choice in terms of accepting the mentoring. That's something I would urge everybody to do, is to accept mentoring when it's available. But I really identified with that. And so it drew me in immediately, and I enjoyed following them on their journey. And I'm excited to read the sequel because I thought it was great. And this was the first Becky Chambers work that I've read, and I loved it so much. So I'm excited to read more of her work. Seth, you were muted.
I was muted. My dog was barking. Sorry. Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay. I know a lot of, big Becky Chambers fans, and I like Becky Chambers, but I have a limited tolerance for her. I think sometimes her writing comes off a bit preachy and saccharine. But what I really, really like about Becky Chambers is that she does the work of imagining a better future, of imagining something more utopian. And that's what I feel like I'm missing in a lot of sci-fi, is like I want to stop. Like, I love dystopias. They're super fun, but at the same time, like, we don't really, like, I think there's more value in putting imagination into a utopia, and how could the world be better, and what would that look like? And I think this book does a really lovely job of, like, maybe in the future we can be decent people, and we can deal with AI and robots and stuff ethically, and we can live in ethical communities and care about each other and mental health. And I think this book is really strong in that case. And I just read A Prayer for the Crown Shy, so I'm kind of conflating the two books. I'm not sure that I'm keeping them separate. But also in the second book, there's some really just lovely descriptions of, like, the way currency works, the way communities work together, and I love that. So I this is one of my favorite novellas in the category this year.
Cool. Go ahead, Trish.
Well, I'll admit to some initial frustration with this, because I had a hard time with just deciding to be a tea monk and not even apparently doing any basic research on what kinds of herbs should go into teas, let alone taking a mentor. And for most of the book, it felt like he was just drifting. And I've read a few books where a drifting character is fun, but usually that's because they end up stopping drifting and taking a decision. And sort of, I don't really feel like he quite gets there here. Dex doesn't. I also had a really hard time believing in a society that just waves a cheerful bye-bye to its robots as they all leave, and walk into the wilderness and do nothing apparently to stop them. And maybe that's a failure of my imagination. Maybe it's just the society that I live in, and if we get to a better, more peaceful, more giving future, we could get to a society where the humans would let something like that happen. But I certainly struggled with suspension of disbelief in that bit of world building. But once I got past that, it was a pleasant book. But it didn't really, other than presenting a nice vision of a happy, peaceful future, it didn't really do much for me as far as ideas. Not for me. For other people, obviously it does.
That's the nice thing about having the discussions with multiple people, is we get multiple perspectives. So
right.
Go ahead, Cora.
Well, I generally like Becky Chambers' work a lot. I love the Wayfarer series. However, I was a bit skeptical about this one, because when I read the description, it was like, oh, it's about a monk and a robot. And now one thing I really don't like in my science fiction is religion. I don't want religion in my science fiction. And I initially assumed it would be a Christian type monk. It's not in the end. Because we don't have tea monks. It would be great if we did. So I did not read this before it wound up on the ballot. And once I did read it, I was pleasantly surprised, because, well, it has Becky Chambers' trademark, nice, pleasant characters. the religious angle is not actually strong enough to be annoying. Yes, I know this is my own personal bugbear that I don't want religion in my science fiction, but it is really something, especially if it's Christian religion. It's just, I don't want this. Want this here. Here, but it's not annoying, and I actually like the idea of tea monks. Tea monks, and basically this book feels like a good, hot, soothing cup of tea. Also like the idea that the robot uprising was basically the robots walking off into the woods to enjoy nature and do their own thing instead of killing all the humans, which is just a pleasant change from the standard idea of a robot uprising. And I'm not sure if this needed to be a novella. It would probably have been fine as a short story or a novelette. It's a bit it doesn't really offer a lot of meat for the novella, but it's a nice, pleasant story. It's well, like I said, it's a nice cozy story, like a nice cozy cup of tea.
Go ahead, Juan.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I mean, everybody's talking about, the robot uprising has been gone for at least the last 10 years, if not longer. I mean, I think we live in an age where our computers, we're all sitting in front of one right now, and we know that it's probably not going to turn against us. And even if they did, what do they want from us? It's not like they don't eat, they don't have sexual desire, and, they would go off somewhere. I mean, that was the whole story of Her. I mean, this is the second half of Her in that kind of way, that they come back and said, hey, we found our space, how are you guys doing? And I thought that was very positive, but I think the robot uprising is gone, and I think we're better off for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Gretchen. Nope, you're still on mute.
I clicked the wrong button. Sorry about that. I unclicked the raised hands, but not the unmute button. So one thing I really liked about the story is I've recently just been I'm very interested in stories that are willing to talk about death and existence and what that means. That's something that's been on my mind a lot. My mom passed away last year, and just a lot of things. I've just been thinking a lot about the way we talk about death and the way that we talk about our own existence. And a lot of it, I feel like it's very rare to have a non-religious perspective that is beautiful and hopeful. A lot of times, like the most positive views of death that we get depicted is from a religious perspective with the belief in an afterlife. But like this story, there's a conversation toward the end between Mosscap and Dex about what existence means and what it means to be reconstituted. The robots are broken down and then rebuilt up into new robots. And Mosscap talks to Dex about how is that really any different from what happens to human beings when our cells break down and we are absorbed back into the universe and then rebuilt up into a new entity. And it's really beautiful, and it's deeply empathic, and just a really honest and kind of lyrical and powerful, beautiful way to look at death from a non-religious perspective about, there doesn't need to be an afterlife in the religious sense. That part of what makes life beautiful and meaningful is that we are made up of, both literally and metaphorically, the atoms of the universe, and we are also made up of pre-existing life, in the same way that the robots are. And it made me think of Midnight Mass, which is a TV show on Netflix. It's a horror show. Very, very good. Highly recommended. But it also has a couple of conversations about death from characters who are non-religious in a very similar way, in that allows kind of an atheist perspective that's not just purely nihilist and negative and when you die, you just decay and whatever, it's fine, don't worry about it. Yeah. It talks about death and existence in this way that makes it seem beautiful and amazing. And there's this passage where Dex talks about you and I, we are just atoms that arrange themselves the right way, and we can understand that about ourselves. Is that not amazing? And Mosscap offers this perspective of isn't existence just really magical and beautiful? The fact that we are alive and exist and think and can understand what we are, is that not beautiful in and of itself? And because of the way the world has been going recently, like this book, I felt like I needed to hear that. I needed to be reminded that like existence is precious and beautiful just for being what it is. There's something deeply beautiful and compelling just about being sentient beings, understanding that we are made up of the atoms of the universe. And I needed to hear that. This was a book that I needed for right now, for where I'm at mentally in the world. I needed a book that was not just a cozy cup of tea, but a book that was willing to be like, look at the small things. I like the idea of like a coziness, like the God of coziness, the God of small things, of like just small comforts. Like it's okay to just take joy in existence, to just be and exist in the world. This felt like a deeply kind of anti-capitalist book as well. This kind of like, you don't need to be producing, you don't need to be making, you can just exist and have a cup of tea and you are valuable. That is a valuable thing to have. And I just really like that for where I'm at right now. This was a book that like really helped me to just kind of recenter myself and be like, oh yeah, it's okay to just exist right now. And it's hard to exist right now, but like I can just take joy in the small things. And I just really liked that.
Yes, very cool. Go ahead, Olaf.
I really struggled with this book because I really like Becky Chambers. I think Becky Chambers is a brilliant writer, but I feel like her career, her oeuvre has followed a path of every book less happens than the previous book. I this is going to make me sound real basic here, but I like stories in which things happen. And that's why I struggled with it. And there's so much I love about it. I think a lot of people know I am obsessed with workers' rights. I'm a former labor union guy. I believe in workers' rights. And robots have often been a stand-in for the alienation we feel from our labor. I feel like in this book, Becky Chambers was almost deliberately giving a middle finger to Isaac Asimov, a well-deserved and well-needed fuck you to Asimov's relationship with work, with employment, and with labor. I can rant about that for a long time, but I won't. But I mean, robots fundamentally are a metaphor for the worker. I mean, you look at Rostrom's Universal Robots, it's all about workers reasserting their workplace rights. And I love the fact that Becky Chambers goes into this story asking a question, asking important questions. What do we need? What is the meaning of work? What is the role of workers? Why the treadmill? And I would love those questions to be asked in a story in which things happen. And I'm sorry, this, depending on my mood in the day, is either the second spot on my ballot or the fifth spot on my ballot, because there's so much I love and so much that just picked at me. She's such a great writer, though.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, I'll try to keep this brief because I'm afraid I've got to take off here shortly. But I just kind of wanted to bring it back around to sort of comparing this story with The Past is Red, because they both, in their own way, try to take positive views of, I mean, you could almost say post-apocalyptic. We don't really know exactly what happened in the past of Psalm for the Wild Built, other than the robot, not so much uprising as refusal of their assigned purpose, non-violent refusal as far as we know. So, but sort of a post-industrial, post-factory, I guess, society, and taking a positive view of that. I think the stakes are maybe a little lower in Chambers' book, but I also think in some ways she's less willful about it than Valente's story is. You know, because Tetley's optimism has been described more than once here as relentless, and Mosscap, when Mosscap is, you know, saying, why can't you just, you know, take the universe as it is? It's in the context of the story, I think, is a little easier to listen to and accept where Mosscap is coming from on this. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ivor.
I just wanted to maybe bring together something that Gretchen touched on, Cora touched on, and actually disagree with Cora, and I will die, I'm sure. But I disagree from the point of view of science fiction. Science fiction and fantasy world builds reflects the world around us. We take some of the elements from us. You can't get away from religion. It will always encompass into something in some form. You can have atheist societies in science fiction, but one of the things I've noticed is that even when you have like emperors and, you know, stuff like that on the fantasy, still a godlike religion, you're still worshipping them. And it's the same with death, and you know, and from Gretchen's point of view, yeah, death is a very good thing to approach in any literature, including science fiction, because it poses the question of what next. Even if there is nothing, you still want to know if there's something next. And again, I know that's why probably religion will always feature. So that's why I quite enjoyed it over the past few years, picking up things like the Sparrow and the, you know, the Canticles of Live, etc., because it's touching on things that I can recognize in my own society, in my own world.
Yeah. Cora's not here to answer back for that. She had to drop it. So did Rob. So I understand. We're getting long here. So anything else anyone wants to say on this one? All right. So let's move on to A Spindle Splintered, and Trish is going to lead that one off just as soon as she unmutes.
Sorry about that. Okay, Spindle Splintered. The main character, Xenia Gray, herself describes what's happening at one point as a Spider-Verse of fairy tales.
Yes.
So this is very much a book that moves between modern world and fairy tales because it's a multiverse. And the main character, Xenia Gray, who is herself doomed to death by a teratogenic disease that, you know, from some corporate malfeasance at some point. She discovers that there is a multiverse of Sleeping Beauty worlds or stories, because that's her favorite story from childhood. And she is, during her 21st birthday party, which she was thrown by her best friend, Charm, like Prince Charming. It was a Sleeping Beauty themed party, and she touches the spindle and gets drawn into a fairy tale world with Princess Primrose, and many things happen. She is trying to help Primrose in belief that that will get her back to her own world. And it's a story about, you know, not accepting fate, and fate turning out to be very different than what you thought it was, because people's motivations can be very different from what you thought it was, and making alliances. And I loved this story.
Yeah. In the chat, people are talking about the pronunciation of the name, because I listened to this one on audio and it was pronounced Charm. And so I never made that connection that you made, but I think you're absolutely right. That's fun.
Yeah, I have no idea what Alix Harrow intended.
Yeah.
Alix Harrow writes about multiverses. You know, her I first became aware of her with her book, The 10,000 Doors of January, which is about a different, you know, it's about totally different worlds. This is about worlds that all throw the same theme. And it turns out, you know, that there are princesses and of one sort or another in many kinds of world. You know, you may as well just say female protagonists, because, you know, some of them are warriors and some of them are who knows what. Yeah, I think it's really great about, you know, taking your own agency and figuring out what you want to do with yourself, what kind of battles you want to fight or not fight, and stepping outside of expectations. So I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kristen.
So I really enjoyed this one. I mean, it was short and sweet. And at the end of the day, I didn't think it was like super deep, but what I loved was the subversion of this fairy tale and the way that we get this totally new perspective on like the villain. I really liked what was done with the villain. I thought that was a great explanation. What I really liked about this one and the sequel, I've read the sequel too, is that the villains aren't changed. Like they're not like just like, I'm remembering the Disney live action Maleficent movie. It kind of felt like Maleficent was not the same character that she was in the cartoon. You know, it's just she's a different character and we sympathize with her because she's totally different. She's just, you know, good. But in this one, it felt like, no, the bad guys are the same bad guys. They're doing the same things. It's just we do get a lot more depth into like why, and they become sympathetic, not because they're behaving differently, but because we get this new perspective, which I thought was really well done and cool.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ivor.
I wouldn't have read this if it wasn't on this list. And I read it after a particularly stressful day at work thinking, let's get it over and done with. It's a palate cleanser to me, but in a really, really good way, because I'm an old person, 50s onwards. And I forgot, I really enjoy fairy tales. And I really enjoy a different take on a fairy tale. And I thought it had an energy of youth, which sometimes I think we forget as we get older. And I could actually really relate to the character thinking, yeah, crushes, I remember those vaguely. And hoping that a bit of magic and a bit of luck and a bit of, I don't know, something different would happen. And I really enjoyed it. And I must admit, I'm already going to line up the Mirror Menders, the sequel as well, because I thought it was actually just a great tale, a great way to spend an evening and think, yeah, fairy tales, they rock.
Yeah. I like the notion in this one is just kind of flipping the fairy tale and saying that the spindle and the magical sleep was essentially a way to get Primrose out of that bad marriage. And that was really interesting, that it wasn't meant as a curse, it was meant as a blessing.
Right.
And it makes you think that all the other ones, it makes you think about all the other previous tales, where in fact it has been very dominated by men and women just do as they're told. And, God.
Yeah. Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. I mean, the thing is, all you got to do is put Alix Harrow on anything, and I'm gonna check it out. And sometimes I don't get the time to check it out until it does show up on the awards list. But I really, the bit that I kind of remember, I really like is when a bunch of them there's a part in the book where I think they get a bunch of them from different time streams all get together, and you've got Space Beauty, and you got all of the others, and I kind of. Again, I think it could be a Generation X thing, because I think Sesame Street did this all the time and send up popular. Although they're doing it, this is done in a more loving way and not in the cynical or kind of over the top Jim Henson way. But it was just a fun story, and I also look forward. I hope I can find time to read it before the end of the year. Mirror Mended, but definitely look forward to it.
Yeah, I mean. the story kind of hangs a lantern on the whole Spider-Verse thing, right? Where essentially you do have a team assembled, just like in that
Mhm.
movie. I always wonder with really, really recent pop culture references, like that I'm sure that hurts the long-term kind of survivability and influence of the story, just because those references go away.
Yeah, but this was writing about, well, she's 21, but she's still very young. And
Yeah.
if she wasn't texting and using current references and stuff, she wouldn't have felt as much like a real person to me. If
Yeah.
there were not cultural references, then what kind of teenager or 21-year-old is she even?
Sure. Yeah. I thought it was interesting here too that you had two characters where it mentions that the main character and Charm have had some kind of relationship in the past, but most of all, through it all, they've just been best friends. And I like it when you don't have like two token gay characters that have to be in a relationship, an actual, be in a partnership. They can still be friends, and that's cool. Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, I think to follow up what you just said, I think you have to be careful if you're using it for like description. I always remembered, I think Ellison referred to some writing advice I got from Algis Burtis. Don't say something like, he looked like Cary Grant, because even though he's an iconic actor, he might be a bad example of that, but you don't know if that'll stand the test of time. But again, I think Trish made the example that, yeah, you do need to talk about pop culture references. It also makes it kind of real to me. I mean, I think until it was very rare in my head, I see it was very rare until Buffy came along that you ever heard science fiction shows refer to other science fiction shows or other pop culture things in general. I mean, and they don't, and also, well, if you're talking about in the future, it's hard because then you got to create your own pop culture. I mean, although it's funny to see, we were talking about the Orville Online on the chat, but one of the things that it's a great show, but it is kind of weird that they don't have their own pop culture. They all seem to be obsessed with 20th century and 21st century sitcoms or, watching old shows, because it's also hard to create a pop culture. But I'm sorry, I'm getting tangent, so you should grab the hook on me. But I just think that you do need that pop culture to kind of keep it authentic in a way.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ivor.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke earlier about suspending our disbelief and what we can believe in the worlds, and I must admit the ability to text into the netherworld, should we say, did kind of throw me slightly. But after a while, I got it. It was a good device. But the one thing is, I'd like to know who the provider was for that, because I can't get that just going into the town with my provider. So if we could have that same provider for real life, that'd be great.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olaf.
The thing is that there were two of these novellas that were sort of peppered with intertextual references. This one and Catherynne Valente's novella. And I feel like Valente was more successful in weaving those pop cultural references in. So when I'm thinking about intertextuality, and referencing other cultural works, I always ask, is there an intentionality behind it? Or is it just, being part of the milieu that they are writing from? And I feel like Valente was making a point with the pop cultural references. This is showing that it is a place and a people who are dealing with our trash, with the consequences of our actions. Yeah. And I didn't know if the pop cultural references in Alix E. Harrow's work felt as intentional to me or as purposeful. I liked this overall. I think Harrow's a very solid writer. I liked the narrative arc. Just as an interesting aside, if Harrow wins, she will be the youngest author to win a Hugo for Best Novella on her own. Sorry, the youngest female author to win for Best Novella on her own, because the only novella by a female writer who was younger than her was co-authored, and I think that was Starlight, and that was Spider and Jean Robinson as a co-writing pair. So yeah, no single authored work by a female writer under the age of, I want to say 40, has won it for novella.
Anything else anybody wants to talk about this one? I'll say my library had this one on audio, and I thought it was quite enjoyable. It was a good audiobook.
Agreed.
Okay, I feel like everybody's getting tired because we've been doing this for a while. So just as we wrap up here, any kind of final thoughts about this year's selections, if you want to do that, and kind of as you go, also mention where people can find you. So we'll start with Juan, since you put your hand up.
Oh yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to do this, but the stuff that I think was missed on the ballot. I mean, there was one thing that I thought was cool that I put on my ballot that didn't make it, was Sleep in the Soul by Greg Egan, which I believe was in Asimov's, and it was a crazy story where in this world, in Western society, people did not go to sleep, and this guy was knocked on the head, went unconscious, and they buried him alive, and he has to escape, and everybody shuns him, and he tries to go to New York City and make a life for himself, but P.T. Barnum tries to recruit him for his freak show, and he doesn't want to do it, but he goes, if you don't come with me, you're going to be trapped. You're going to be dealing with a lot of bad stuff. And he does have to deal with that. But then he finds out that he can help out the abolition movement. It's before the Civil War. Beautiful story. Might be a bit bonkers, but I found it engaging. And if you want to reach me, best place is right now Twitter at Rainbow War 71.
Nice. And so I do want to just go ahead and say thank you to everybody who did this. I really appreciate it. I haven't done novellas before. This severely impacted my ability to finish my novel for my next episode, but it's okay. It was worth it. The thing I do like about novellas is I don't feel too bad about putting them on my Goodreads, because I feel like, they count as books. But Gretchen, thank you so much for doing this and for reaching out. I'm really glad we had you. So where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at G_lovesbooks. And if you're interested in any of my writing, like I said, I haven't done as much recently, but I write for thefandamentals.com. And in terms of missed, one story that was on my nominee for novellas that didn't make it was Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor, which was amazing science fiction story. I was deeply disappointed not to see it on there. Just because I love everything Nnedi writes. I have yet to find something of hers that I don't just think is excellent. And I really would have liked to see that on the list, because I think this year, one of my biggest struggles with the entire ballot was that it still feels very white. It's a problem that I think that the Hugos have had for a long time and in general, and it is getting better. But I would have liked to see some more people of color nominated in every category, and that was just specifically one that I had in mind for novellas.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, G_lovesbooks is where I'm at on Twitter. Cool.
And Kristen, why don't you go ahead and wrap up next and tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, so in terms of what I wish had made the ballot that did not, I actually, for Adrian Tchaikovsky, I actually had his other novella, One Day This Will Be Yours, on my ballot rather than Elder Race. I like that one better. And for Catherynne and Valente, I actually had Comfort Me with Apples, which I liked better. I still love The Past Is Red, but Comfort Me with Apples was amazing. And another one that I haven't heard as many people talking about, but that I really enjoyed a lot was We Shall Sing a Song Into the Deep by Andrew Kelly Stewart. It was just very atmospheric and interesting. It had a kind of a horror feel to it, but alternate history. I thought it was great. But anyways, if you want to find me, I am primarily a booktuber. You can follow my channel at Kristenelle SFF Reader, and that's Kristen, Kristen, and then ELLE. And I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at KristenLSFS.
Cool. It's great to have you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay, Scott, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Sure. In terms of, things that missed the ballot, absolutely agree with Gretchen in terms of remote control. That was on my ballot, and would have liked to have seen it here and recommend it for folks that may have not. In terms of finding me, most weeks you can find me on my podcast, Narrated, talking with friends, mostly about audiobooks. But again, usually most of the discussion is pretty relevant, even if you're not listening to the audio edition. Again, we're talking mostly science fiction and fantasy, but we do go into to other genres as well. On Twitter, I'm at Sullery, Sullery, but am more often tweeting from the Narrated account, which is _narrated. So thanks again, Seth, for having us all.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. And let's see, Olaf.
Well, I'm on Twitter at Hugo_book_club. My wife and I do a blog, and we're up for the Hugo this year, which is swell. On my Hugo nominating ballot, I really struggled between 3 different novellas, all by Primi Mohammed, and they were all excellent. And What Can We Offer You Tonight was the first one from Neon Hemlock Press. Annual Migration of Clouds, which was released on Tor.com. And my personal favorite, her novella for Rebellion, which was These Lifeless Things. And it's about how we understand the past. It's about this conversation. It's a researcher has found a document detailing an invasion, and the invasion isn't well understood. And can she understand the past? And so you get the story from the perspective of the person looking through the crisis and the perspective of the person pulling together that history. And I think Prima Mohammed is just terrific. I think she won a Nebula for one of those novellas, if I remember correctly. And I'm looking forward to seeing the Hugo long list, because I just have this feeling that all of us Prima Mohammed fans split the vote. And I'm going to say I suspect these 3 all got a certain number of nominations. And if we'd been a little more focused, maybe we could have gotten, the Tor.com one onto the ballot at the very least.
Lori, you're our other Hugo Award nominee this year. And by the way, Olaf didn't toot his own horn. Oh, or maybe you did. I can't remember.
He did.
You are on the ballot this year. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you. So I nominated ones that a couple people have mentioned. I was disappointed that Remote Control didn't make it because I had nominated that, and also the Annual Migration of Clouds. And I also wanted to mention, because I just haven't heard a ton of people talking about it as much as I would have liked, Remote Control reminded me that I'd also nominated Noor for Best Novel by Nnedi Okorafor, and that is a wonderful novel. So if people have not read that, I really can't recommend it enough. I was sorry that didn't make the ballot for Best Novel. And in terms of where people can find us, I am one of 3 co-hosts of the Hugo Girl podcast. We're at HugoGirlPodcast.com, and then we're on all social media as at Hugo Girl Podcast. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I do pretty much all of the tweeting, so any bad takes are mine. Don't attribute them to my co-hosts. And then Haley does a lot of our Instagramming, so that's where you can find us. And thanks for letting me jump in here kind of at the last minute, Seth. It's always fun.
No worries. Always glad to have you. Juan just reminded me I should also shout out Cora and Rob, who are not on the call anymore at this point, but Cora is also Hugo nominated this year on the short list. I will put all the links in the show notes and in the description of the video as well, so you can find her and find Rob as well. Let's see who's left. Trish.
Let's see. I'm most easy to find on Twitter at PEMATSON. That's my name, at PE Matson. I'm a longtime crew member of the Skiffy and Fanty show. I may someday return to fan casting on the Incomparable Network. And I also guest on other podcasts often when I get the opportunity. And I'm one of the mods for Arvanella Ron's Twitch channel. That's most of my fandom activity. Sadly, there was a gap in my reading this year, and I didn't have any nominees for best novella. Just didn't work out to read novellas last year. So I'm certainly happy to have had the opportunity to read all these books, novellas. Yeah.
Cool. And then Ivor.
Oh, well, I don't have anything to plug. As you know, I am the reader. So all I can say is I read what we do for these, and it introduced me to a whole new set of authors. I've got tabs open on my second monitor of all the things that have been mentioned. So it's fantastic. Always a pleasure to be in this. Really enjoy the short stories, really enjoy the novellas and novelettes. So that's really kind of my bag. Where I can be found, I lurk on Twitter at Tears of Tin Man. Really just kind of follow people rather than tweet, but anything to do with books, cats, and cooking, I'm there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again. Did I get everybody, by the way? I think I did. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody again for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm not very organized, so it's a miracle that any of these happen, let alone, for all the short fiction categories. So yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on my end. Oh, I guess I should probably say, and if you want to reach me, you can find me at Hugo's Podcast. That's where I do most of my tweeting. And of course, you can follow the podcast. Hugo's there. I also do another podcast called Take Me to Your Reader, where we talk about adapted science fiction. So you can check that out as well. Anywhere you find podcasts. So thank you so much for watching / listening. Leave a comment. Let us know what your favorites were. And yeah, thank you again. Bye-bye. And now let's stop.